you, Jesse. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kellen. This is Matt. As Nick mentioned yesterday, we are RPAG's resident barbecue cleaning experts. We're here to talk to you about a new service that FlexPath has available. It's called Two Guys and a Grill for just $500, limited time only. Not only will we clean your grill, but Matt will wash your car.
And we do a conservative, moderate, and aggressive car wash. Plenty of flexibility there.
Just kidding, of course. We are RPAG's custom solutions team. We're going to be talking about target date funds. We will be washing something. In the figurative sense, we'll be washing our hands of the traditional way of thinking about lineup design. And sticking with the idea of the conference, the theme of reimagine, how can we incorporate participant behavior to reimagine the way that we construct investment menus? Specifically, we want to bring in these concepts of behavioral finance into the discussion, right? We spend so much time as advisors talking about what investments we offer within our lineups for clients and relatively less time on how participants use those investments, which ultimately has an even bigger impact on end results, right? And behavioral finance is really nothing new, right? We've successfully applied these behavioral finance concepts to plan design concepts like auto-enrollment, auto-escalation. So really it's just a matter of applying this to target date funds and the way we think about other funds that we offer to participants. However, since target date funds are obviously the most important investment that we offer to retirement plans, we wanted to spend most of our time here. Everyone knows these facts, but 78% of participants use target date funds, so this is where we're going to get the most bang for our buck as far as optimizing outcomes. So luckily, there's been a lot of research over the last year or so that talks about participant behavior and how they're using target date funds. So we wanted to review a lot of that research with you here today. But in one of those papers, Fred Reish, well-respected ERISA attorney, maybe not quite as much as our own Joel Shapiro, but he has a quote that I thought was particularly pertinent for our topic today. So it says, plan committees primarily focus on the quality and costs of the plan's investments, yet how participants invest is of even more importance. So an analogy that I like to use here is like a set of golf clubs. So for those of you that know me, you know that I am not a golfer like Matt is. I say I don't golf because I don't enjoy it, but the fact of the matter is I don't enjoy it because I suck at it, right? If I were any good, I'd probably like it a whole lot more. So you could get me the best set of golf clubs money can buy, and I'd still shoot 140, and that's probably being generous, and I might break a few of those clubs along the way in frustration. But the point is, you could spend the most amount of time getting the best investments, best performing target date funds in an investment lineup. But if participants are misusing those investments, the end result is still going to be suboptimal, right? So it makes sense to focus on what matters most, which is, of course, the participant themselves.
So Kellen's golf game is beyond repair, but we do have some things that we can do to help participants. So to help participants as much as we can and to maximize the value that we're delivering to a plan sponsor relationship, we need to understand who participants are, the actions they're taking, try to infer why they're taking those actions, gauge the success of them, and then just run some common gap analysis. And a really easy way to classify broad participant types or profiles is by looking at participant investment decisions. What are they choosing for their investments? If you look at the outer sides of the screen here, these participants, these two groups, are using a lineup as we typically think about a lineup and as we intentionally and conventionally design it, right? And probably in the same proportions as well, where you have over twice the amount of participants just picking a single target date fund versus those DIYers choosing their own funds from the core lineup. So that's as we intentionally design a lineup. Then there's this group in the middle that's kind of doing a hybrid and using the lineup as we do not intend, which is they're choosing a target date fund, but also combining that with one or more options from the core lineup. And what's the most surprising about this is just how prevalent and numerous this group is. It's actually more people doing this than picking all funds from the core lineup. And the investment decisions that these participants make do a great job of explaining really what their goals and characteristics are. So obviously your single target date fund users are more unengaged, unsophisticated, they're not quite as comfortable with investments, and therefore they're looking for the simplicity, the autopilotness of a target date fund. Your engaged investors that are more comfortable with investments and therefore are going to pick from the core lineup to get the personalization that they desire. And then you have this slightly engaged group that similarly wants personalization, but they're not quite as comfortable with investing and savvy, so they don't want to leave that prepackagedness, the professional management of a target date fund, so they end up combining that with another option in the core lineup. And at first you might think that that decision in that group is naive or unsophisticated or it's unintentional. But if you compare the demographics of the slightly engaged group with the engaged group, there's actually much more similarity there than with the unengaged. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that group is actually more sophisticated. They tend to be older, more sophisticated, have higher salaries, balances, and savings rates. So this action of or desire to customize and combine with another option in the core lineup is actually quite deliberate. It's actually quite intentional. And of course, there's going to be some participants in this group that are misusing the lineup or target date funds. It's going to happen no matter what, but there's clearly a need there. So coming full circle to how we design a lineup, you might think that the unengaged and the engaged group, they kind of have what they need to accomplish their objectives, right? And we're going to see that potentially there's improvement there as well, but there's clearly this gap here for the slightly engaged group that wants some customization, but they want to hit the easy button. If Kellen's getting some grill cleaning fluid from Home Depot, he doesn't then go home and add like 4 ounces of rubbing alcohol to it. If he did, he would be more of like a chemist. He'd be in the engaged group. He'd be making his own thing from scratch, right? It's going to lead to a worse solution and then not as clean of grills for you all. No one wins.
So clearly there's a gap, right? That slightly engaged group, the mixed target date fund investor, doesn't have that obvious solution to fit their needs within the traditional way we construct menus. So the question then is there demand for a type of solution there? The evidence, the data suggests there is, and then survey results also suggest that there's demand. So in particular, 72% of participants responded in a recent study that they would use risk-based solutions, risk-based do-it-for-me solutions if they were offered in their plan. That number jumps up to 80% amongst high-income earners, so makes sense with the stats that Matt just mentioned as well. And then 64% of plan sponsors said that they were interested in adding risk-based do-it-for-me solutions to plans also. So as advisors, I think it makes sense for us to stay ahead of the curve and see how we can offer these types of solutions for our clients. So also, right, more research here from In Fred We Trust. He says, in other words, many participants may want to invest based on their personal views, experience, and other considerations beyond just their age, but there's a catch. And the catch is that there's no easy button, right? You either have the do-it-for-me age-based target date fund, or they're forced to use the core funds and completely do it themselves, and they may not feel comfortable doing so. So clearly there's a gap here, and the ironic part from our standpoint is that risk-based solutions used to be the norm, right? You can look at this chart. As soon as 2004, risk-based options actually were the majority target date or majority QDIA in plans, 51%. All we've really done over the last 20 years is trade risk-based do-it-for-me approaches to age-based do-it-for-me approaches. And you can see there's still a small percentage of plans, about 12%, that offer both risk-based and age-based. But the challenge there is these things don't speak to one another, right? It's still an either-or proposition for the participant. And this is some of the data that we were looking at when we thought about FlexPath and said, hey, if we can simply combine these two methodologies of investing and give participants the ability to personalize in both ways, we can really solve for that 25% slightly engaged group where they don't have a solution today. So what we really wanted to do now is talk about not just how this type of solution can benefit that slightly engaged group, but kind of flip it on its head and say, what are the consequences for not offering these types of solutions, for not incorporating what we know about participant behavior into the way we construct lineups, because the consequences actually can span across all three investor types.
So the first one we want to look at is the unengaged investor, potential consequences there. And Q1 gave us a terrific observation window, and I know terrific is not a word that's commonly used to describe 2020, and especially Q1, but in the least, we'll say that it was informative for us to look at participant behavior and also target date fund performance. And what we saw in Q1, peak to trough drawdowns, was a pretty wide disparity of returns amongst different target date funds, as we've seen historically, right? So you had 2020, these retirement vintages, losing anywhere from 8 to 24%. So it wasn't quite as egregious as the drawdowns we saw in the financial crisis of some vintages, 2010 then being down 51%, but a pretty wide disparity amongst returns here for different series. And the key is, did this match participants' expectations? I would venture to say that a lot of participants that lose a quarter of their account in retirement were actually pretty surprised about that. And similarly, although more positively, there's probably some participants when the market's down 36% that only lost 8% that they were surprised, although of course in a good way. So this is a challenge with traditional target date funds, that there's really no alignment between a participant's expectations of their fund's behavior and how that fund actually performs. They really don't know, even if we do a ton of due diligence at the plan level. And then perhaps most importantly, really the question is, can they stay the course and can they weather this storm? And what we saw is that they really can't. We saw $10 billion of outflows just in the month of March, just in the 2020 to 2030 vintages. So think about that. That's March. That's the worst possible time. It wasn't like they got out in January and they avoided some of that drawdown. They're getting out at the worst time and kind of locking in those losses. And think about target date funds being the QDA in most plans we just saw. They're getting periodic contributions like every other week for most participants in their paycheck. So to have net participant-directed outflows is actually quite difficult to have. So what are we saying here? What we're really saying is that this unengaged group is actually kind of engaged. They're just engaged at the worst time. They can be really reactive during periods of drawdowns and volatility. And this is why our target date fund fit analysis takes into account participant behavior elements like sophistication, risk aversion, and employee engagement. And a last consideration here that could potentially influence this is the level of risk of the target date fund. So most target date funds today have an aggressive glide path because the biggest challenge in our participant-directed world is people are under-saving. An aggressive glide path, by taking on more risk, you can kind of make up for that a little bit. Hopefully that leads to more return, gets participants' account to where they need to be. But what it can do is exacerbate this panic selling. Larger drawdowns makes people pay attention more and makes them hit the eject button quicker. So the key here is that timing is important. We moved on to a baseball analogy. You need to have the right bat. You need to have the swing mechanics down to swing the bat, and you need to have the timing. This is a great swing, but the timing was just a little bit off. My swing was always perfect, as was the timing. That's why I played in 10% of games. Kellen didn't have it. He ran track, so maybe you could blame it on the shoes. But we know that this can be pretty costly to employees. You see the impact of them being out of a diversified portfolio and in cash for just 1 year. It can be detrimental to their ending account balance, and that only gets worse over time.
So what are the consequences then for the other investor types, the slightly engaged group, the mixed target date fund investor? The biggest consequence is really the inefficiency of the end portfolio, right? So the intent is there. Two of the top three reasons cited by these participants of mixing target date funds is to either increase their potential return by adding in more equity, riskier investments, or on the contrary, reducing risk by adding in more conservative investments. So there's purpose behind their actions, but the end result is still unfortunately very inefficient, right? Just by nature, doesn't make sense. Target date funds aren't designed to be used in conjunction with core funds. There's probably a lack of disciplined rebalancing and systematic roll downs, and it may not even be aligned with their desired risk to begin with, because they're not professional money managers, right? They don't exactly know how to do that. So inefficient portfolios is probably the biggest. But another consequence for this group that we see in the evidence is extreme allocations. So I was actually pretty shocked with these stats. Do-it-myself investors, the non-target date fund investors in general have extreme allocations. About 22% are all equity or all bond. That number jumps up to 60% for investors that used to be 100% invested in the target date fund. So basically the equivalent, right, of a participant going all in, leaving the target date fund, and then trying to go all in equity or fixed income. And clearly, just like in any card game, you go all in poker, you're going to have a high risk maneuver that oftentimes leads to very poor results. The other stat related to this that I found shocking was that there's a lot of attrition in target date funds. So actually within 10 years, target date fund investors, 49% of target date fund investors leave the target date fund series, 49% over a 10-year period. And you can see a lot of those investors tend to use these extreme allocations, which is clearly not an optimal result. So then for the engaged investor, the one that's mixing the core funds to create their own portfolio, what's really the consequence for this group? I think we have seen studies time and time again that show this, but the main consequence is underperformance, right? They want to do everything themselves, but they're going to underperform an equivalent target date fund series. And as you can see in the chart, really regardless of your age, young, older participants, they tend to underperform that target date fund. So the more we can give participants that ability to personalize, but put up bumper rails, so to speak, the better off outcomes are likely to be.
So we've assessed the consequences and really what can go wrong with target date funds. Let's take a turn to Positive Town and talk about the steps we can take to avoid those consequences, how we can be helping participants, and then, of course, the CYA aspect of this, which is decreasing liability for clients and you. And what's great is the DWEL lays out some very specific steps that we can take in terms of selecting and monitoring target date funds. So the biggest, what they mentioned 8 times, is this concept of what is the glide path risk level, and then aligning that with the participant characteristics. This is why we talk about fit and suitability every single presentation that we have. And I'm proud that at RPAG we had our fit analysis 3 years before the DOL even said you should be looking at suitability, and a lot of you were using that before then. Understand the underlying investments is of course important, and I love referring back to these DOL tips when I'm going through a target date fund analysis with a client, just so they know that the process I'm taking them through isn't arbitrary. It's not what I think is best practices, but it's really directly following the DOL tips. That's why we put the underlying funds right in the RPAG system. And then the last worth mentioning here is consider custom. So the DOL recognized that the advantages to custom target date funds were so numerous and so significant that they explicitly advised plans to consider them. So what better door opener do you have to just provide this from an educational perspective, and also to kind of flex a differentiator that you have through a custom target date fund that you have as an RPAG member, which is obviously FlexPath. So I'd say 99% of plan sponsors still aren't aware of the DWEL tips, and unawareness on their part, that's opportunity for you, but it's also opportunity for plaintiffs' attorneys. And we've seen now 2 law firms that have put out ads basically soliciting information from any participant, and they're looking to gather what they can so that they can sue them. It's sad but true. We've already seen few dozen target date fund related cases, and you probably see a new one every month or so. So definitely something that you can use to your advantage to make this a focus for existing plans and hopefully open up some doors with prospective plans. So the specific steps we can take to defend and document this fiduciary decision is the fit analysis, like we've talked about, looking at things like savings rates and employee engagement to find what's the best for the average participant in the plan. And if the fit is really designed for the average participant, a misfit risk analysis is designed to identify the margin of error of that fit analysis. So for example, in this case, we're looking at the savings rates for all participants in a plan. And you can see the majority are saving kind of in this moderate level, therefore need a moderate level of risk. So obviously, based on the fit, that's best for the average, right? That's going to help the most people. But just as many people as they need that moderate level of risk need a different level of risk, need more or less risk. And this goes back to Nick's analogy yesterday. If you heard a CIT session talking about if there was a survey of a company, 400 people submitted their t-shirt size, and the average size was medium, you're going to have a lot of people that need a different level of t-shirt, a different size of t-shirt.
So speaking of kind of sticking with positive, how can we avoid these consequences? There's a few behavioral biases that typically lead to those negative results that we just talked about that we can actually leverage for good if we understand how participants are affected by these biases. So first up is loss aversion. Everyone's probably familiar with the famous study where, when given the option, monkeys prefer being given one apple versus being given two apples and then having one be taken away. So this loss aversion is deeply, deeply ingrained in us. So just some food for thought, right? Are we defaulting participants, and unknowingly at that, into a glide path that is too aggressive, right, for their preferences, knowing that loss aversion is just innate within all of us? And then secondly, can we assuage this bias by simply adding a conservative option to the plan to really give them an escape hatch, so to speak, for those participants that are particularly risk averse? Then secondly, we talk a lot about choice architecture, in particular about efficient menu design. But even with efficient menu design, participants have to work hard to customize their portfolio, right? It's target date funds or complete do-it-myself. So we can make customization easier for them and probably improve outcomes by simply adding that risk-based approach to the do-it-for-me solution. So the classic analogy that you probably heard us talk about is the hot sauce, right? You kind of have three options. There's the mystery hot sauce. No one knows how hot it is, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you got all the different ingredients. You got to make your own. Don't even know where to begin, let alone make it to your desired spiciness. So what do every restaurant, what do? They give you three preset descriptive options. In the case of Taco Bell, it's mild, hot, fire. And participants, or in this case, the restaurant goers simply pick the one that matches their preference. And that's the idea behind adding these risk-based elements. It's easy and constructive, and we're leveraging these participant biases. So the last one is illusion of control. Classic example here is the lottery. People tend to pick their own numbers versus the computer-generated numbers because they like to influence the outcome, or they think they can influence the outcome. And I think this is a big reason why so many participants, a quarter of participants, mix target date funds. They want to insert that level of control. So if we can do that again with multiple glide paths and allow them to insert control, but in that constructive and easy manner, they're going to be better off.
So wrapping up, key takeaways, the first being consider the behavioral finance element of investments and how participants are using investments, not just the quality, which is of course still important. Number two, taking that a step further, design a lineup that's flexible enough for that slightly engaged group to get the personalization that they need while having the easy button. The easy button is very important. Why is there a picture of a dog here? We all saw how cute Bourbon was yesterday for about 10 seconds. But you're around him long enough, and he's a mouth of many machetes, and he's yelping all the time. So some of us need to hit the easy button in the dog world, and I did exactly that a month ago by getting a 3-year-old dog that had been trained professionally for like 2 months. So that's him. Basically, while I'm talking to you on the phone, he's sleeping at my feet all day. I hit the easy button. Participants need to do it too. And lastly, use the misfit risk fit analysis and FlexPath to alleviate these challenges. So wrapping up, what does a behavioral finance approved lineup look like? So the majority of participants, the unengaged group, they're still just invested in a single target date fund. Not much change there, right? Hopefully, if you do a fit analysis, you're going to capture more of what those participants need so they are better off. And if you're using FlexPath, the transparent naming convention kind of informs them of what to expect out of the fund's behavior. The slightly engaged group we've discussed gets the customization that they need while remaining in professional management. Very convenient, easy button. And then the engaged group, what we actually see is some of them will use the risk-based target date funds because their primary goal is personalization. They can get that, but with better results like what Kellen talked about. Of course, there's going to be those that still want to pick from the core lineup. And it's funny is this is the minority group. All the time we take looking at the small cap value and large cap growth fund, that's really affecting 21% of people. But there's value you can add there too, of course, through the exclusive, discounted, negotiated, standalone CITs through RPAG. I couldn't have thrown another adjective in there. But that's the behavioral finance approved lineup. Thank you all for your time and attention. Stay safe, healthy, successful, and positive. We look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jesse, and good talking to all of you again in interesting situations. So I think we can all agree that before COVID, sales were already hard enough, and this has just thrown another challenge our direction, right? So I can tell you at NFP, RPAG, starting in March and through June and July, sales really shut down. Like, we had some stuff that came through that was already in the pipeline, but it was a huge challenge. And so, hopefully what I bring to you today is just some ideas that we've seen to either build pipeline for the future, the opportunity to sell as much as you can right now. But, I think nobody loves company more than misery. So I first wanted to get a poll from everybody. Where is everybody relative to their sales goal, that they set at the beginning of the year? So we saw the question was, where are you and your team projected to finish relative to your original goal? No new sales, right? A good amount of people. Oh, let's see here. The results are coming in. So about 43% are behind, 39% on track, 11% ahead, and 7% have a record year, right? I wanted to share this because a couple things. One, I think a lot of people are on track or behind, but two, there's always going to be some people with sales that are ahead or having a record year, even when the odds are stacked against them. And the reason is because in my opinion, is sales aren't perfect, right? A lot of the times it's luck. A lot of times you try to put yourself in the best possible situation, and hopefully things capitalize, right? And so while I'm going to be giving some ideas that I've talked to with the NFP team, with the RPAG members around the country on things that have helped improve the sales experience for people, I would encourage you all to utilize the chat function, talk to people as much as you can during this conference, after this conference, get to know your RPAG network, because a lot of people are ahead of schedule and having, record years, and I think we can all learn collectively from each other, and when we do that, we really see all boats rise. That's kind of the beauty of being a part of this membership group. So, as I go into our conversation about sales, I'm a big fan of mindset, and I think a good mindset can generate a lot of positive outcomes. And I think a lot of you may be in the same boat as me, where in the middle of COVID and really in the quarantine when it was really hitting bottom around April time, I had the COVID blues big time, and one of the things that really got me out of that was the Last Dance documentary about Michael Jordan. So this was a documentary that was about one of my heroes, right, growing up, just one of the all-time competitors with the best mindsets. And there was a lot of lessons learned through that, but one that really resonated with me was, when they talked to Michael about early in his career, they talk about how he came out of North Carolina and he was this athletic beast, right? He was faster, he's more explosive than everybody. He created the term Air Jordan. It seemed like he changed the game through both his competitive drive, but also extreme level of athleticism and natural talent. And as they go through the documentary, you kind of hear about the story of the last season, and it goes back to flashbacks. And they ask him at the end, in the 10th episode, the last episode, what was his favorite championship? What was his favorite moment through the whole process? What was his masterpiece, thing he was most proud of? And he talks about it was actually the last championship he won with the Bulls against the Jazz. And this was much later in his career. So it wasn't straight out of North Carolina where he was super athletic. What he said was he still had that athleticism, but it was a lot harder, right? Father Time had done its work. His knees hurt, his back hurt. He had, he wasn't as explosive. He wasn't as strong as he once was. But at that point in his career, he had learned so much. He learned the technique. He learned the mental challenge behind it. He learned how to read people and deal this harder fact set that he was dealing with, having an older body. But he did it with more mental prowess than he ever did early in his career. And I think that mindset is the mindset we should all be taking during this really strange time of COVID, right? Things aren't in our favor, right? We don't have the crazy bull market that we had before this. We don't have a lot of people investing in their company, tight labor rates, so people were really looking to enhance the benefits, right? We're dealing with a very high unemployment rate. We're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. We're dealing with a lot of people with different challenges, but that doesn't mean we can't use our mental fitness, right? Our mental strength to overcome some of this stuff and make this year our masterpiece, right? And how we overcame that and still had a lot of success. So with that, I think to take on that challenge, we first need to understand the challenges that your employers are facing. And here's some of the key things that we've heard from our clients and prospective clients that what they're dealing with now specific to a COVID world, right? They're dealing with layoffs and furloughs. I think we saw a lot of that in March and April. Some people did it too quickly. Some people waited too long, right? But they dealt with a lot of that. And so it almost became hard to have a conversation with somebody that was laying off tons of their staff about the best practice of retirement plan because they were dealing with this. So it's important to understand they might be dealing with this. And frankly, their job might be at risk as well, the person you're talking to. The next thing we're hearing is that they're struggling to manage cash flow, right? Anything that was what we found to be saving participants money may not have been impactful if we didn't have a way to tie it back to the CFO story of how are we helping them manage cash flow across their organization. Because a lot of people were worried about this short-term hit really being devastating in the long term for them. So understanding that's a key thing to bring up. Next, people were starting, as things progressed, to understand how do we get people to return to work, if ever. I think you're seeing a lot of companies out there now saying, we're going to have a fully remote workforce. Others are saying, okay, we do want to return to work, but how? Especially if you have multi-state organizations with different laws in each state, what do they have internally structured to decide when people come back? How do they do it? How do they do it safely? Right? So this is a huge challenge that's occupying a lot of your clients' times and prospects' times. Engaging that remote workforce. So if you do end up having people that are remote now and even in the future, how do you engage them? I think, especially with growing companies, there's this almost tendency to think, well, as we create new things, word of mouth just gets around just by bumping shoulders in the office. Well, if that's a way, how do you create that camaraderie? How do you share information? How do you build upon our collective resources with a remote workforce? And how do you get a remote workforce to really appreciate working for your entity now, right? How do you create your company's brand to retain that key talent with a remote workforce? How is that different? And then lastly, doing more with less, right? They now are really cutting down and tightening their belt, a lot of these organizations that are struggling. How do they continue to retain talent? How do they continue to reward people? How do they continue to recruit people if they do have growth parts of their business, right? And do all the best practices that with their human capital management that they had before. So, understanding what people are struggling with, I think is important because to Nick's point yesterday, we need to understand what their key priorities are and then help them fix those priorities. And that's what the best salespeople do. It's not try to be the best at everything and fix it. It's help them prioritize those decisions, right? And then execute on a solution for them. So where does the retirement plan fit into that whole list? The answer oftentimes is it doesn't, where I would say what we found is a lot of people at first glance said, it doesn't. But then what we started to do was we realized that Schlichter and team weren't slowing down because of COVID. If anything, what we saw with them was they viewed this, their employers, right, in their mind, the enemy as a distracted enemy, an easier enemy to win a lawsuit against. So plaintiffs' attorneys continue to remain active because now not only have they figured out how to win a lot of these cases, but they now have a distracted employer that's dealing with that whole list of things I just went through, that it might be harder to defend best practice of retirement plan. So making sure your prospects understand that I think is important. But also Department of Labor audits have not stopped, and the prudent expert standard really doesn't go away. So it's a tough situation to be in for an employer, right? They are dealing with all these new challenges, but they still have the same old challenges to deal with. And so I think it's incumbent upon you all to help them understand that and to help them execute on these things in hopefully a way that's done in a very time-efficient manner. So we found, though, when we were talking to people about these, we got a lot of deaf ears at the beginning, and a lot of it was the core issue was that decision-making internally was a challenge. If you think of it this way, if you think about yourself, you're an HR director, it's April, you realize the retirement plan probably could be a little bit better. There's nothing in your mind as an HR director, maybe as a non-expert at the time, that's extremely broken. And all your executives are telling you, we just got to find a way to stay in business, right? Like if it's not on fire, I don't want to hear about it. Like we've had many people say, this isn't something I have a permission to talk about until 2021 or 2022. And the challenge is that they might need help, right? Their decision making, they still might need help with some of these key best practices, and it could become a really big problem if they're not on top of their retirement plan. But internally, that decision making, there's almost this shyness to bring up a best practice, or at least there was at the beginning of COVID. I think we're starting to see a bit of a shift and return to normal. But I think it's important for you to not only understand what people's problems are, but what do the internal dynamics look like? How are they making decisions, and how can you help them navigate change? So what do you do, right? How do you be that change navigator? Well, I'll tell you at NFP, we've really tried everything but the kitchen sink. So hopefully some of the ideas we tried to keep our pipeline full, to keep moving things down the sales process, to help identify those problems and quantify them. Hopefully you take some of the ideas and take them with you. But just like anything in sales, nothing here is a silver bullet. I think you're going to find each organization is a little different in what they need. Also, the way you position things might be a little bit different, but hopefully you take some ideas today that you can build into your practice and then enhance your sales pipeline, both in lead generation and closing. So here's some ideas that we found to work. The first and foremost, and the number one feedback I got when polling and interviewing a lot of our salespeople across the country was this idea of paying it forward. So connecting your network with your network, right? Understanding, people that don't compete with you but might be a referral source to you. Think payroll companies, think benefit brokers, property and casualty brokers, HR consultants, right? Understand the value that they bring to your clients and the problems that they help solve. So now you have in your toolkit more than just what you can help them with, but also what your network can. Because the beauty of a pay it forward approach is if you can help a client, you can introduce one of your partners that you know and you vetted and you trust to help a prospective client with one of their problems that you can't solve as a part of your scope. Right now, you have a friend in there that's going to advocate for you and hopefully get you in eventually. But also, you've now just built rapport with a client to help add value. So what are some of those areas you can add value even when it doesn't help you? Right? We found return to work, right? Researching, I'll tell you about Checkpoint, one of the options that we vetted through our NFP Ventures lab. But understanding what are some resources to help people return to work? What have you seen other clients of yours done and connecting them with each other to talk about how they approach those conversations? Yeah. What are things they need help with on the benefits and workers' compensation side? I've seen a lot of people introduce and get to know the payroll HRIS market and understand what some of the issues are there with the data cleanup and human capital management, understanding a lot more than just the benefit side of it, but also the compensation side of it and what's competitive and what's not. So getting an idea of where you can add value even when it doesn't help you. It does a couple things. Like I said, it gets your friends in there to hopefully add value and build rapport with the client, but it also immediately creates some credibility. If any of you all take the CKP program, there's a lot of classes through the UCLA Management School, and you hear from a lot of the business school teachers there, and one of the ideas they talk about is the quickest way to generate credibility is to actually do something that doesn't immediately benefit you, by doing a favor that's not in your best interest necessarily, by helping them with something that has no financial benefit to you. That's a great way to build a relationship and build rapport because you're creating trust, you're helping them solve a problem, and you're helping your friends, right? You're helping your referral sources get in there. So get to know your network, get to know where they can help them, pay it forward. The next thing we've seen to be extremely successful in helping increase closing rates is to fix the problems within your scope. And this goes back to anybody that's taken red flag. A red flag has never been more important in the philosophy. At a quick summary, red flag is this. The first step is help them find what is the key problem that is their organization's dealing with and prioritize that problem. So the idea is you can do that through asking questions, open-ended questions like what keeps you up at night? What do you think is the difference between your plan being from good to great? Open-ended questions. But the other way to find that information is to share trends on, here's other things, here's some of the key problems we've helped our clients with. Which one of these most resonates with you, right? So figure out what that problem is. And some of the problems that we're seeing is that, and one of the most common feedback that we got from prospective clients was that they needed to manage cash flow and they needed to learn how to do more with less. So a lot of people were looking at cutting their match, temporarily suspending their match, moving away from safe harbor, but they still had this challenge of making sure the plan was successful. It still it worked as a retention strategy, but also it got people to retirement. So what are some levers you can help them pull if the input is less? How do we create more with the output? How do we do more with less dollars being put in by the employer on behalf of their employees, right? And so some ways we've helped demonstrate that are right through the collective investment trust and an exclusive scale and negotiation there. Asking record keepers proactively for a concession during COVID, right? A lot of record keepers went out and proactively did it for the market, but why not do it for your existing clients, right? Like why not see which existing clients record keepers can help with? And a lot really stepped up and came to the table. A lot of them said, we want to retain this client, we want to help them weather this storm, right? And they cut their fees for a quarter or 2 quarters. And then also helping them engage in a remote workforce. I heard from one of our clients where they first came to us with a problem where they didn't want to put in the CARES Act changes. They didn't want to give employees easy access to their money. They didn't want to increase the activity for loans. Well, the provider made a mistake and accidentally allowed for 100% balanced loans and allowed participants to follow the CARES Act rules, even though the employer didn't want that. So when we were starting to go in and fix this problem, we also had, the plan advisor had a great idea on our team that said, well, why are we just focusing on the remedy here? Like, let's talk about what proactive medicine could have gone into place to fix this. Like, why do people need a loan from their 401k plan, right? That's 100% of their balance. Like, there's got to be a financial planning issue here. Like, do they not have an emergency savings fund? Are they really struggling with COVID? So what we did was we actually ended up exploring WellSense to give financial planning resources to their employees to understand and help them prioritize, where to spend that next best dollar, right? Maybe instead of somebody pulling from the 401k plan, they could have considered, trying to establish, reduce spending by following a budget, working with a financial planner, or establish an emergency savings fund, right? Maybe they had some cash value from some of the insurance policies they might have had through the benefits program. So things like that, right? Thinking of how you can help people fix their problems and help their employees fix their problems are key, but also helping them quantify how big that is, right? So in that case, where people were taking loans, we quantified how big of a financial planning problem there was because we saw that 15% of the population had actually requested a loan for this, construction company. So help them figure out how big of a problem that is, to help them prioritize that. That's how you become a change navigator. That's how you help somebody, really with their business concerns and aren't just a benefits communicator that explains why, what you do is important. It's helping them make decisions and drive behavior change, which overcomes some of the previous challenges I mentioned, which are that internal, it's hard to justify a best practice, but if you can see that it is such a big problem and you make it important, now you're going to help your clients, make positive change and drive business for yourself. The third thing I heard from our team was scrape the bottom of the barrel. So this really started in June and July, we found, where companies were starting to get back to normal, decision making was starting to feel a bit more normal. It was, or let's say, people more comfortable with remote-based decision making, right? With the CFO in their living room, HR director in their living room, instead of it all in one committee, conference room. So what a lot of our advisors that have been successful this year, and I think probably a lot of you that have said you're ahead of goal, or even having record years did, was they went back to reevaluate what opportunities they'd talked to in the past that said, well, not now, or, hey, this isn't that big of a concern for us. And you ask how it's going. What we found is a couple things. The first thing we found was that a lot of non-specialist advisors are way over their skis. So if you think about what you all did, you specialist advisors during this time of COVID, I'm sure you were busy, you were super, super busy helping your clients with a storm of things that were going on, right? Answering questions on the viability of keeping a match or not, like handling the market volatility and talking to participants on a regular basis, proactively promoting, the stay the course kind of memos maybe to go out to them so people weren't locking in their losses at the bottom of that market dip we saw from the reaction to that. There was tons of things I'm sure that you were doing to help them, but a lot of non-specialist advisors, think especially wealth managers, think about somebody who's 90% of their practice is wealth management and they have 10% 401ks, and it's a 1 or 2 person shop. That's really hard if they don't have a system like RPAG to keep managing and staying proactive with their 401k clients, if they have wealth management clients dealing with crazy market turmoil through this whole thing. So what we saw was when we just asked how it was going with some of these bottom of the barrel prospects, things that were just lukewarm or kind of had died a couple years ago, we saw a lot of their advisors were just MIA. They weren't there. So a lot of them quickly just handed over broker of record to our team because they realized they needed somebody with scale, with the expertise, somebody with the resources like an RPAG that could proactively continue to meet their needs and help them navigate this storm as a true partner. So we realized that, we got some business from that. We then started making case studies. And I've heard from a lot of RPAG members, this has been a very, very popular thing to do as well. That's really helped with sales right now is making these case studies of how did you help your clients through those times of turmoil, right? An example I use all the time with our team is I talk about how Joel Shapiro started weekly compliance webinars for our clients to dial into, where we had kind of what was coming down with CARES Act, what were the things that could apply to your plan, right? A centralized resource to be able to spread to all of our clients. I had a lot of our participant advisors talk about some of the success stories and how they help people navigate this storm at the individual level. So, and we've now memorialized those and created those as a part of our pitch deck, right? We've put them in our overview of services. We now are saying, well, why does it matter to have a truly specialized advisor, somebody that's taking 3 days out of their week this week to learn how to improve their practice, right? Like that is a huge statement to what you all are doing, and you're doing great things for your clients. So memorialize them, right? Your clients don't know you're doing that. Pat yourself on the back, but do it in a way where it shows them the outcome, right? Paint the story for them where here's where you are now, here's where you could be with us, and help them be a bridge to get there. So lead generation has been one of the biggest, I think, areas of pain, especially for what I call like a lot of old school salespeople, right? Like some of the best salespeople I've met are just the best networkers in the world. They're out golfing, they have study groups, right? They're always out, they're always meeting with their clients. They have such a great personal connection with them. And there's a ton of RPAG members that fall into that bucket. And I think this has been a really big challenge to keep that normal networking going on when there was quarantine and there's a lot of restrictions on travel and things like that. So we've seen a lot of creative ideas to reimagine networking, to try to make the best of the situation. Golf, I think, remains one of those interesting things. It was fun for me to see, actually. Nick is golfing now. I'm probably gonna have to try to get out there with him, but it's interesting because golf, though, has been kind of this silo of people, and what you're gonna see in some of the biggest feedback I'm getting across employers is that diversity and inclusion is a huge, most important thing to a lot of employers right now. I think it's going to generate better outcomes for everybody, and we've presented on this in the past, and it's something that if it's not a part of what you're talking about, I would highly consider you looking into it. But diversity and inclusion is important because your decision makers are very different than what they maybe look like in the past, and that's a great thing. And so you don't want necessarily just one type of networking that's going to appeal to one type of decision maker. You want to have a broad group to engage everybody. So we've seen a lot of people explore things like some creative stuff I've heard on is how to make a cocktail and running a cocktail event with somebody, at-home cooking classes, DoorDash lunch and learns. If you can't, go in and meet with their participants, how do you create something where you can actually still create that lunch and learn type environment? And then one company I want to emphasize here is Argo. So we've actually looked at a lot of other industries and said, how have they engaged their clients outside of their retirement plan? And Argo is somebody that we identified as they give a sommelier guided experience for people in your position, but for your clients. So they'll have a virtual wine tasting where you can teach your clients of any kind of knowledge on wine, right? Like how to actually taste wine, what are the things you're looking for. And this is a great way to engage people regardless on if they're a wine person or if they're not a wine person. But the reason I want to mention that is because this virtual connection, people really miss, I think, human interaction. And the more you can engage them, the better you're going to be. And I think there's just new and better ways that you're going to see other industries evolving to overcome this quarantine type environment. So look and see what are your clients doing. Ask them what are their salespeople doing to engage their clients, right? And then ask your clients, where are they in their decision making? So because a lot of what I'm presenting today was us just asking our clients, well, what are your biggest concerns? Would you actually consider networking with somebody? What socially do you still like to do with some of your vendors and partners that you work with? So think of some new ideas, talk to each other, hopefully get some ideas flowing there. So hopefully it gives you an idea of some lead gen, how to prioritize things, how to overcome some of these challenges with your clients. But what are some tools that you have that RPAG is providing that can help with that? First thing I'll talk about is the CIT mapping. So Matt and Kellen and their teams, they do this for me on a daily basis. They create CIT mappings where we pull either the plan information that's been shared with us by the prospect, or even we can get the 5500 data. And because plan upload link, which is basically the revenue sharing in our system, tends to be pretty accurate, right? We can actually usually figure out what the revenue sharing and expense ratios are for a current 5500 lineup, and then show what the potential investment cost savings would be if they leverage our size and scale. This is huge, and if this was a year or two ago, I would have told you, qualify your time, get a 408B2 first to see if somebody's willing to share the data with you, and then do an analysis like this. Now, it's pretty hard to get appointments, and if you're finding that, what I've done is I've worked with some of my best referral sources, property and casualty brokers, benefits people, right, internal and external, and I've said, give me a list of some of your best clients that you'd like to introduce us to. I'll pull the 5500, I'll spend some time, I'll do an in-depth write-up, and I'll create this CIT mapping to give you a quantifiable number as to why having a meeting makes sense, right? Because if I can go to a $50 million plan and I'd say, hey, if you just leveraged our size and scales using top tier managers, we could drive down the investment cost by $90,000 a year, right? That's probably going to be twice as much, if not more, than what you're charging for just advisory services, right? So it's a huge way to get meetings. The other big quantifiable point we've been seeing in these write-ups and 5500 searches are the target date suitability type conversations. So a big piece of what I do with my time is I look at that 5500 audit report and I see, what does the plan design look like? And it'll usually tell you, is there auto enrollment? Is there a match? right? Is there profit sharing? And you can usually figure out what the contribution is, and you can find out one data point, which I like to call the default contribution percentage, which is what does somebody put in from their own, the employer puts in if they do nothing. So if you have a plan with auto enrollment at 6%, with auto escalation up to 12%, and a match as 100% of 3, right? That's the employee puts in 12 if they do nothing eventually, and the employer puts another 3. So 15% would be that default contribution percentage. Well, if your default contribution percentage is 15%, it's not a full fit analysis, but that's sure a sign that you probably have a pretty well-funded participant population that's saving enough. They probably don't need a ton of risk with that target date fund, right? So if you're in a very aggressive target date fund with over 50% equity at age 65, the left hand, a well-funded participant base, doesn't match the right hand, which is a very aggressive target date fund. Another quantifiable thing to find in a 5,500 write-up to, again, create the magnitude, create the significance of wanting to take that meeting with you. So definitely leverage that team as much as possible to create these. And even on the 5,500 side, make sure it's a good referral source so you're not just spinning your wheels on somebody that won't actually get you a meeting. But if you have people that will tee it up and they just need help teeing up the meeting, this is a great tool for that. Return to Work series has been great for us. One of our top producers, Tom Hoyer, has been extremely successful with doing a lot of cold outreach, a lot of value add. Like at the beginning of COVID, he actually sent a lot of educational resources to help teach your kid at home. It had nothing to do with what you're doing to help the retirement plan, but it helped to build rapport with a lot of these prospects and giving them a nice tool of what are some best practices and resources you have to help teach your kids at home. But he's also looked at Return to Work series. So Checkpoint has been found through our NFP Ventures lab, where we're out finding things that can help our clients. And RPAG members can access these resources as well. But Checkpoint is a great app, right, where it basically says where people are and it has the ability to track your workforce. It can track temperatures. It can have them check in at certain places. So a big challenge we're finding with Return to Work for employers is the ability to do it in a compliant way where you can actually track if people have symptoms or not, and when they're in and when they're out of the office, which is very important to do it safely and successfully. So this is a great resource we've introduced to a lot of prospects that they're not ready to talk about their retirement plan yet, but man, by giving them this resource and giving them something that's now helping them with their biggest problem, we're friends, right? We're in a texting relationship with that prospect, right? I wasn't the subject matter expert in this, but we introduced the team that was, we paid it forward, now we've added value and done a lot of help there. WellSense is another huge value in helping access that decentralized workforce. It's probably one of the fastest growing types of benefits, but by doing it in a way where you're taking work off your employer's plate to do all the proactive outreach, it's overcoming one of their biggest obstacles, which is traditional education usually relied on them to do the logistics of this. You're taking work off their plate to do the promotion engagement. You're also helping people navigate a really weird financial situation, helping them overcome uncertainty. So cannot emphasize how much WellSense has been our top selling service. Even we've sold more standalone WellSense deals than we have new clients this year. So something I'd highly encourage you to take advantage of. And then the last tool I'd recommend you look into is our non-qualified plan team. Right now, the most important time where if you have people you have a safe harbor plan and it's expensive and they really are in a tough spot and they're trying to manage cash flow and they're exploring maybe not doing safe harbor for 2021, what you might want to look into is doing a match that they can afford, if any at all, but then now you might be subject to refunds. What a better way to catch those refunds in a non-qualified plan and helping those executives and helping retain those executives that they can actually still afford to keep around, right? And put in hooks, put in some of those golden handcuff type plans. So Tony Green's going to be presenting later in the conference on this. I highly recommend you see his situation because we've sold quite a few of these plans as just an extension of our plan design conversations and helping people manage cash flow. But what you see, it's a win-win-win for everybody, right? It's a win for the organization because they've managed cash flow. It's a win for the executive because now they can still save and they're not discriminated against because of failed testing. And then it's a win for you because these plans do generate more revenue for your business. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time. Hopefully you took some of the potpourri of ideas that we've been trying and can implement those in your practice. But happy hunting to all of you and wish you the best of luck. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ryan Tierney with American Funds. Today, we're going to cover the presentation called Learning to Speak the Language of Wealthcare. In this presentation, we'll talk about how the silos between health and wealth as it relates to corporate benefits are quickly degrading, and your role as a DC advisor is more important than ever. To be that instrumental tool to positive retirement outcomes, we think it's imperative that you learn the language of wealthcare. Now, all of us know that words matter. In fact, when we think about how we use our words, we understand that it tells a lot about us. If you look at this slide, what you see is a picture of what we here in the Northeast would call soda. But if you're living in the Midwest, you might call it pop, or somewhere else in the country, Coke, or even tonic. Another example of how words matter is something like this. If you live in the United States or you live somewhere around the world, what you call this thing is going to be different wherever you're from, whether it's a traffic circle or a roundabout or even a rotary. Where we're from and how we use our language tells a lot about us. I always like to think about a personal story that I use. It really has to do with the first big Italian Sunday dinner that I went to with my now wife of 15 years. Before we walked into her grandmother's house, she said, "Listen, this is important. The red stuff that gets passed around the table, that's called gravy, not sauce. And if you call it sauce, this will likely be your first and last big Italian dinner." Right? Words matter, and it was never more apparent than that night standing outside my future grandmother-in-law's. We get a sense of what we mean by how words matter when we start to think about the words that we use on a daily basis in the retirement industry. We use terms like glide path and zero rev and sub TA. And unfortunately, more often than not, we actually daisy chain these words together to create long, confusing sentences like, thanks to the PPA, we can now use a TDA as a QDIA. This idea of using words, while it helps us all to understand what we're talking about in our industry, it's not until the shoe's on the other foot that we realize words, although they can be extremely expressive, often confuse folks who aren't in the same industry. Let's put that shoe on the other foot. Here in front of you, you see a list of words or a list of acronyms that are often used by benefit brokers. When we see these words and we see them strung together, we know what it feels like to be on the other end of that equation. But we think here at American Funds that to the extent you're willing to learn this language, to add these words to your business, we think the opportunities are abound. And that's really what we're going to be covering today. In learning to speak the language of wealthcare, we're going to cover three distinct topics. Number one, the paradigm shift. What reasons do you have to learn this new language? From there, we'll go on to what we call a quick primer or some key back pocket ideas. Right, if you were going to travel to another country and you didn't speak the language, you'd want to know a few important terms like how do I get back to my hotel and how do I order another round of drinks? And then from there, we're going to move into the third section, education into action. Let's not forget who we're here to help. And how do we take this new language and put it into practice right away? So jumping into our first section, we thought it was appropriate to use this picture here of a smelter. A lot of people don't realize that steel, being one of the most flexible and strongest materials known to man, isn't actually found in nature itself. It's not until you superheat iron and some kind of carbon, most likely coal, that you get this stronger, more flexible and durable alloy. And we think that by adding this language of wealthcare to your practice, you will do the same in creating a more flexible and stronger practice. But to do that, we really got to get started on what we're seeing in the market right now. Now, all too often, presentations in financial services deal with what's happening after accumulation, what's happening as people enter retirement. But what we're going to focus on here today is really what's happening to folks while they're still in accumulation with the backdrop of rising healthcare costs. Unfortunately, 2 out of 3 bankruptcies are related to some kind of medical bill. Over 4 in 10 don't have the savings to cover their deductibles. In fact, 1 in 6 might even sacrifice food, housing, or take on an extra job to pay for the rising cost of healthcare. In fact, millions even skip care and critical medications. And unfortunately, many of us have seen our coworkers, friends, and family even resort to crowdfunding for things like medication. And what that ends in is essentially 40% of people actually running short of money in retirement for problems that they faced in accumulation. Right? So what we think about as it relates to remedying these problems is really what an employer can do to build a robust benefits package. And when we think about what the employer is really trying to accomplish, it's essentially 3 things. When they build their benefits package, what they want to do essentially is improve productivity, right? They want to increase their bottom line, and that's understandable. But beyond the bottom line, they want to attract or gain and retain top talent, and they also want to improve worker morale and engagement. They want to create an atmosphere that that employees want to be a part of. But with those three lofty goals, what we find, unfortunately, is that when we peel back the numbers and we start to ask these employees how they feel about their benefits package, we tell quite a different story. In fact, 2 out of 3 employees find their benefits very difficult to understand. 37% say they get no education or feedback. Only 29% of employees are aware of something called caregiver resources, but unfortunately, more than 45% of employees actually qualify as caregivers. And only 12% are actually right now accessing what we call the voluntary benefits menu. So there's quite a disconnect there as far as what employers are trying to achieve and what employees actually realize they're getting in the form of the benefits package. Now, many of us in the financial services world, in particular in the 401k space, feel as though if we just got more time with the plan sponsor, if we just got kind of a bigger seat at the table, we could start to impact some of these weighty problems that are plaguing the benefits package. Well, we did research here, and what we found was that for the average 100-person plan with $5 million in assets, the employer is spending roughly $5,000 a month to run that plan. That's with contributions, administration, etc. But when we look at that same 100-person employer, what we see is that they're spending roughly 8 times that much as it relates to healthcare. In fact, $40,900 per month. So that being said, it's no wonder that the employer, the head of HR, the CFO, the CEO are spending an inordinate amount of time on healthcare rather than retirement. So with that, let's move on to the next section. We understand that we all need more time in front of the employer. And when we get that time, what are some of the things that we want to talk about? Well, Section 2 really goes over that quick language primer. And what are some of the back pocket ideas that you want to have when you sit down with either an employer or an employee to demonstrate your knowledge of not only the retirement world, but also what's happening in the benefits package. Again, we talked about how words matter, and sometimes foreign terms can put us on our heels. What we've got in front of you right now is a list of some of those terms that you're likely to see, whether you work in the benefits world or not. Just as a consumer of healthcare, these are terms that you've seen in the past. Things like premium. How much do I have to pay per month to keep my healthcare coverage regardless of getting sick or not getting sick? What's my base payment? What's the difference between in-network and out-of-network? How does a copay different than coinsurance? What's a deductible and what's an out-of-pocket? Now, we're not saying that you need to be fluent in these terms, but what we are saying is that these are things that you should have at least a cursory knowledge of so that when we're talking with employers and employees alike, we have a better understanding of where that benefit dollar is going. And when we think about that benefit dollar, we can't help but think about the primary driver to health insurance cost. Right? And that comes in the form of really 4 different packages, the largest being what we would call the PPO, or the Preferred Provider Organization. Right now, 44% of employees across the country are covered by what we call that PPO. Just coming second to that, as far as number of employees covered, is the HDHP, or the High Deductible Health Plan. Right now, that High Deductible Health Plan is covering roughly 30% of all employees across the country. The big takeaway here is that just between these 2 health insurance mechanisms, we're covering roughly 74% of the working population. So just by knowing those 2 terms, you have quite a bit to talk about with quite a few of the employees that you're dealing with on a daily basis. Finally, rounding out the 2, you've got HMO, or the Health Maintenance Organization, covering 19% of employees. And then lastly, the POS, or the point of service, covering just 7%. So when we think about this rising cost of healthcare, what we really find is that it's those 2 first mechanisms, the PPO and the High Deductible Health Plan, that are really driving up healthcare costs. And it's not until we understand those costs that we can start to make recommendations to employers and employees alike on how they're spending their benefit dollar. Now, before we leave this section, we also want to talk about the voluntary benefits menu. And you see in front of you a slide with a German Shepherd, and that was done on purpose because, for better or worse, what we find is that employees tend to take better care of their pets than they do themselves. Right? This idea that pet health insurance is a $3.3 billion a year industry is something that we, as DC experts and professionals, have to grapple with. As we ask for employees to put more and more into the 401k, and they continually, or more often or frequently, respond with, but I also have other things to pay for, like pet health insurance, we need to know where we fall on the depth chart of dollar expenses in and out of an employee's wallet. With that said, let's take a step back and look at this broader kind of calculus around how health insurance has gone up over the last several years. As of 2019, thanks to the Kaiser Family Foundation, we know that the average family premium is roughly $20,000 a year. Now, the employer pays the large majority of that. In fact, the lion's share at $14,000, and the employee pays $6,000. So over the last 5 years, that number has only gone up, and it's increased by roughly 22%. Ahead of that, however, is the deductible cost, over the last 5 years going up by 36%. Now, all too often, it's easy for us on the 401k side of the equation to look at what's happening in health insurance and say, wow, good thing we're not in that business. Those premiums continue to go up, and I'd hate to be the professional that has to give that news year in and year out. But what's interesting is that we're not actually blameless in this conversation. If you think about the Secure Act and the idea that someone using automatic escalation had a maximum of 10% just as far as 2 years ago, now thanks to the Secure Act, that number has gone up to 15%. So really, not even over 5 years, but with the stroke of the pen, we've seen an increase of 50% as it relates to automatic escalation. So we're not blameless in this kind of race for wallet share, but we do have an opportunity. We think advisors who are asking for more into the 401k, who are asking employers more often to use things like automatic escalation, have an incredible opportunity to educate employers and employees alike as it relates to where that more is going to come from. We all understand that the average employee is stretched. They only have so many dollars to put into things like 401k and HSA and the myriad of benefits that make up the voluntary benefits menu. So we think advisors who can point to a solution, again, where the more is actually going to come from, right, stand out head and shoulders above the advisors who don't. We think there's a tremendous opportunity for you all, right, to bring solutions that are essentially perhaps net revenue or even paycheck revenue or neutral, to the extent that employees are able to increase their contributions to things like 401ks, but actually see no real reduction in their take-home pay. And the idea is they can do that by leveraging what we might point out as inefficiencies on the benefit side of the equation. And we're going to go over 3 of those inefficiencies right now. The first being telemedicine. Now, if there's a silver lining to this COVID conundrum or this COVID pandemic, it's that more and more people are familiar with something called telemedicine. When we started building this presentation in late 2019, telemedicine was not a household term. But despite not being a household term, more than 90% of large employers offered telemedicine. 50% of those employers actually offered a financial incentive to the employee to use telemedicine. But even more unfortunate is that roughly only 8% of employees actually used telemedicine last year. So we see that as a huge disconnect, not only in education, but a disconnect in the efficient allocation of an employee's contributions. But what we're saying is that to the extent employees understand telemedicine, understand not only the benefits, but the savings, those employees are more likely to increase contributions to their 401k because they understand they're getting savings from the benefit side of the equation. The next is something we call mail service pharmacy. It's no secret. We all know folks who are taking multiple prescription drugs. Many of those drugs are what are known as maintenance medications. And as maintenance medications, they qualify for mail service pharmacy. This is another win, especially in the COVID era, in that normally if I wanted to refill a prescription, I would have to call it in, or my doctor would have to call it in. I would have to then go either stand in line at CVS or Walgreens, or in my car through the drive-thru for a 1-month supply. But thanks to something called mail service pharmacy, we can now get a 3-month supply of that same maintenance medication at a cost of roughly 2 months. So the idea being that we can save that extra or overrun through mail service pharmacy, and again, be allocating those prescription drug costs back into our 401k. The last, something that unfortunately not many employees also understand, is this idea of preventative solutions. All too often employees forego care, as we saw in some of the previous slides, because they think that the services they're looking for actually cost quite a bit of money. And that would be true. But the IRS every year prints a list of preventative services, one for men, one for women, and one for children, listing out all of the things that are by law free to that employee. Right? Things like mammograms for women, aspirin for older adults, and a host of others, smoking cessation, tobacco cessation. Right? These are all programs that create healthier employees. They help the employee save more money. They create a healthier workforce, which is much more affable to the employer. But the fact that not many employees understand this list of preventative solutions is something that you as the DC expert can point to every time you ask for more. Now, rounding out some of these ideas that we think will separate future advisors from past is your command of Medicare. And again, we're not saying that you need to be an expert in all things Medicare, but you've seen there are large numbers of employees who would like to retire but are uneasy about where their health insurance is going to come from. They're not sure where their prescription drugs are going to come from. So we think advisory teams of the future will be able to articulate, again, at a high level, once someone retires, how they will get that hospital care, whether it's just a cursory understanding of Medicare Part A or hospital insurance, right? Part B, the medical insurance for outpatient visits and going to see their primary care physician. If they don't like either A or B, right? The advisor who can articulate what Medicare Part C or Medicare Advantage is, we think has a leg up. And especially as it relates to prescription drugs, where will they come from? Understanding Medicare Part D or prescription drug coverage is enough to help those employees who would love to retire, but for understanding of where those crucial services will come from. And we think the advisors of the future will be delivering that intel. Now, as we've talked about kind of the reasons to learn the language, and we've talked about the language itself, some of those key back pocket ideas, let's talk about who we're here to help, or really education into action. When you learn a new language, it's not enough just to repeat the dictionary to yourself. You need someone to work with. You need someone to talk with. And that's really what this third section is predicated on. We understand that as retirement experts, all of you have spent an inordinate amount of time, precious time, on your value proposition. To the extent that if you were in an elevator with a CFO or a head of HR, you would know exactly what to say to that executive to win that 401k plan. Now, moving forward, what we see is that more and more DC advisors will be working either formally or informally with benefit consultants. And the question becomes, do you have a value proposition dedicated to that benefit consultant? And if you did, what would it say? What would you have in there? And so what you see in front of you is just a short list of some of the things you might want to highlight as it relates to conveying your value to that benefit consultant, showing him or her that their business would be so much stronger, so much flexible, just like that alloy, if they had you in their corner. Number one, education for employers and employees. I'd argue nobody does a better job of education than the DC advisory teams across the country. We saw that the overwhelming majority of employees don't understand their benefits package. Another majority don't understand or even feel as they get enough information about their benefits package. Who better to step in and fill that gap than the DC advisory teams? Your expertise as it relates to education at both the employer and the employee level is crucial. Next, industry partnerships and client network. If you think about a benefit consultant you might partner with, I'd even bet that for all of the clients in his or her book of business and all of the clients in your book of business, I would imagine that many of them are not the same. In fact, if you were to cross-correlate your books of business, there's probably quite a few opportunities to what we call cross-sell. And it's those industry partnerships and client networks that you bring, right, as ammunition to that partnership. Taking that a step further, we think about market intelligence via similar clients. Probably one of my favorite stories was a DC advisor in Massachusetts who over the years began working with more and more owners of grocery stores and grocery chains. Right now, grocery stores have their own characteristics. They have their own makeups. And what he was able to do was bring in partners that spoke directly to what mattered to grocery store owners, whether it was a mutual fund, asset manager, analyst to talk about what's happening in the consumer staple or consumer discretionary realms, or even a benefit broker that could speak to the benefits that were most important to that grocery store owner. Right? Market intelligence via similar clients is something that all too many advisors have not tapped. Investment knowledge, that's an obvious one. Benefit consultants are fantastic at their job, but they're not RIAs. They're not Series 7 licensed. They don't talk about things like asset allocation and long-term diversification, conversations that become critical when we think about things like HSAs, which we'll touch on in a little while. And then finally, partner resources. You think about all the resources you bring to bear, American funds in particular, for all of the partners that you have throughout the country, your ability to share those resources with benefit consultants is something that they have not seen in the past. Now, once we've talked about what we bring to the table, the question becomes, when do we come to the table? And what we found when we were doing research for this presentation, when we spoke with benefit consultants and we spoke with DC advisors and even HR teams, Interestingly, we found that most of you are doing the same things throughout the year, whether that's communicating, doing enrollment, implementation, prospecting, even closing and upselling things like financial wellness. But unfortunately, we're not doing those things at the same time. It's not until we, number one, create that value prop and then start to look at how we are interfacing with our clients. And to the extent we have a benefit consulting partner, we have a tremendous opportunity to go in and prospect together, to close and to upsell together, right? To combine our communication strategies and act as almost a marketing arm for that plan sponsor and be able to herald what a great job we did as a benefit and DC consulting partnership to create the benefits package in front of those employees today. And then even in implementation. You think about your health insurance, you talk about it once a year, usually in late October, early November. Right? What a great opportunity to also talk about your 401k and then to duplicate that maybe earlier in the year. And what we find is that to the extent you can align those efforts, you're creating extreme value, not just for the employer, but for the employees as well. Dovetailing from this idea of partnering, we thought to ourselves, what about something like a partnering pack or a co-branded partner resource pack? What might go in that? Right? To the extent that you're working with a benefit consultant, what are the things that he or she does that really dovetail nicely into what you do? Where are the savings on the benefit side of the equation? And how can you be better educating people, employees in particular, right, to the gravity of their entire benefits package? One that jumps out right away, biometric screening forms. As a personal story, I'm thankful to work for the Capital Group, very generous company. And at the beginning of each year, we have the opportunity to earn $450 in wellness dollars to go out and have our BMI tested, right? Weight, height, measurement, etc. Now, what's interesting is you have to make an appointment with a company called LabCorp, and then you bring a form to that LabCorp. You sit in line and you wait your turn until you get to the window and you go in to do your tests. But unfortunately, if you don't have that form, things go off the rails pretty quickly. In fact, this happened to me about 2 years ago. I had the form on my phone. I was ready to email it to the receptionist standing right in front of me. But thanks to HIPAA regulations, I wasn't able to email it. They weren't able to print it out. Their recommendation was that I go down the street to the Staples, I print it out, I fax it back to them, then I reassume my place in line, and only once I make it all the way up to the front again do I actually do my BMI testing. Right? So you can imagine I left without that $450. I had to reschedule and come back another day. But if that form were put in front of me early in the year, right, along with other forms that we'll talk about in a little while, right, there would have been a much better experience, and that would have been an extra $450 that I could have allocated appropriately, whether that was to my 401k, to my HSA, or to my voluntary benefits. So put things in front of employees like biometric screening forms. Put information in front of them on their mail service pharmacy provider. It's not always clear who that is. It may not always be the health insurer that they're used to seeing, whether it's on their card or on their documentation. Information not only on the specific mail service pharmacy provider, but also how mail service pharmacy works is a huge win for not only the employee, but for the employer as well. Right? Financial wellness resources. You've worked hard to get financial wellness into a particular employer. How often are they hearing about it? And are they hearing about it in the context of other benefits? As we think about this co-branded partner pack, we think adding financial wellness resources into that is a huge win. Also, a list of preventative services. Again, we spoke earlier, not many employees realize how many of the things they may be putting off due to cost are actually free. And to the extent you create that healthier employee, you create a better employee for the employer, a healthier person for them and their family, and you free up valuable resources that can be reallocated to things like 401k. And then finally, telemedicine. There is a tremendous amount to know about telemedicine. Just the idea that, is it provided by the health insurance carrier? Is it a third-party provider? How does the telemedicine work, and what are the real savings involved? I think one of the best tips I learned throughout this presentation was the idea that telemedicine isn't as plug and play as we might all think. In fact, before you can use the service, you actually have to go on and create a profile. And that sounds easy enough. But if your first run telemedicine is at 2 a.m. and you have a sick child who needs to see a doctor, you're probably not going to take the time to set up that profile. You're actually just going to go to the urgent care or to the emergency room. We think the advisor that brings up this small but critical point sets him or herself far away, far apart, head and shoulders above the advisors who simply don't or can't. Now, that being said, you are a retirement expert. And like any new language, you're going to have an accent, right? There is your original language, your origin language, and then there's the language you're trying to learn. You are a retirement expert, and we don't think you should ever be ashamed of that. Let that retirement accent come through, because employers and employees and even your benefit consulting partners need that expertise. Here we see just a short list of purely retirement topics that you need to own. I'm often saying, or I'm a fan of saying, you either integrate or abdicate. These are conversations that belong to you, the DC advisor. And to the extent you add them to your practice, you become that advisor of choice, not just for the employer, but for that benefit consultant as well. So what are some examples? The newly released Secure Act. Now that seems like a decade ago, but the Secure Act is squarely in the court of the DC advisor. And they need your help, both on the benefit and employer side, navigating that content. We could also add to that the CARES Act. Nobody can talk about the aspects of retirement as it relates to the CARES Act like you can as a DC or retirement expert. Number two, cybersecurity as a fiduciary liability. This is something that we've been talking about in American Funds for the last 2 years. And we think that the advisor who sounds the alarm bell with the plan sponsor to say, as a fiduciary duty, you have to protect plan data, we think that is a good DC advisor. But the DC advisor who can not only make them aware of that liability, but also provide a solution, that is the advisor of choice. A DC advisor who talks about the obligation at a fiduciary level to protect data, and then can suggest, recommend, or even introduce a benefits professional who sells cybersecurity insurance, is that advisor of choice. Not only, again, pointing out the problem, but offering a solution. Next, we've got HDHP enrollment and HSA adoption. When we saw those numbers earlier around PPO and high deductible health plan, PPO covers roughly 44% of the employees, high deductible health plan, roughly 30% of employees. What's interesting is that over the last 5 years, there's been a 10% swing in those two numbers. In fact, PPO has lost 10% market share, and high deductible health plan has gained 10% market share just in that last 5 years. And why that matters to you as a DC advisor is not because we're recommending you're out selling high deductible health insurance, but because everyone who signs up for high deductible health insurance or an HDHP becomes HSA eligible. And once they're HSA eligible, right there we open up a conversation as around or to how an HSA works, not just as a savings vehicle, but as a savings and investing vehicle for healthcare expenses today, tomorrow, and well into retirement. That's a totally and completely separate presentation that we have here at American Funds that we'd be happy to share with you as well, navigating this intersection of health and wealth as it relates to HSAs. And then finally, voluntary benefits that support wealth. As we see the voluntary benefits menu continue to evolve, right, we've moved from things as simple as accidental death and dismemberment and term life insurance to things like emergency savings accounts, whole life policies, right? Financial vehicles that build wealth become the purview of the DC advisor, the financial advisor. So again, to the extent you're willing to integrate, we think your practice will thrive. If you don't integrate, these conversations will be abdicated, unfortunately. So to the extent you add them to your practice, again, we think you become the advisor of choice for plan sponsors across the country. As we round out, we want to talk about active investing and this idea that active investing can be a healthy choice. We are unabashed active investors here at the Capital Group, and we think that matters, not just in our results, but what our results translate to in purchasing power. What you see in front of you is something we lovingly call the shark fin chart. And what we're illustrating here is that for the employee who can outperform the benchmark by 100 basis points over his or her working career, they're creating an extra $227,000 of income in retirement. We can look at that as 13 years of extra income, or on its face, $227,000. And that number is important because it takes a gigantic bite out of what we see as your biggest expense in retirement, and that being healthcare. Our partners at Fidelity tell us that a 65-year-old couple today will spend roughly $285,000 in out-of-pocket healthcare expenses. By using and leveraging active management, such as American Funds, we aim to take, again, a giant bite out of that daunting number so that your employers and employees alike reach that positive retirement outcome that we've promised them. Now, as we start to round out this presentation, depending on, again, where you're from and what you call this, whether it's takeaway, take out, dine out, let's kind of summarize the presentation and really leave on 3 things that we would like to see you do from here. 3 action steps. Number 1, create that value proposition. Not for the plan sponsor, although we know that's critical. Create a value prop for your benefit consulting partners. What can you bring to the table to demonstrate to them that you are invaluable to their practice and they really can't live without you, right? Spend time thinking about that and be able to recite it in that elevator pitch. Next, use the basics of the language to join the critical conversations, right? Understand that there are so many inputs to the benefit conversation, but inputs that you have a command of. When you can demonstrate to a plan sponsor and a benefit consultant that you have a broad understanding of the benefit dollar as it relates to not only health insurance, but those inefficiencies that could be potentially reallocated to a bigger 401k balance, again, you become the advisor of choice. And then finally, work with a benefit consultant to bundle offerings, to do joint meetings, and create that partner pack. Not only do you become more efficient, more impactful, but you're also saving critical time, yours and that of the plan sponsor. So we'll end by saying this, a famous quote from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein: "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." To the extent that you are willing to learn this new language, we truly believe that you will be exponentially better off as far as it relates to your practice, not only for the clients you have, but the clients you'll earn in the future. And with that, on behalf of American Funds and the Capital Group, I want to thank you for your time today, and we'll end here.
Hi, my name is Ryan McNulty from BlackRock, and I'm the lead strategist for our US growth team based in New York. Now, many of you may know BlackRock as the world's largest asset manager, or even for our passive vehicles and ETFs within our iShares franchise. But we have an incredibly robust active equity business as well. And our team manages about $35 billion for growth-oriented investors around the world. Over the next several minutes with you today, I'd like to take some time to provide perspective on what we're seeing in the growth market. It has been one of the most hotly debated subjects in the investment community in these recent years. Growth valuations, large, mid, and small cap companies, and the relative outperformance against their value counterparts. I just want to key in on a couple of themes that we think are really important. And I also want to provide a little bit of insight for you as to how we manage the BlackRock Midcap Growth Equity Fund. But before I do, I want to say thank you so much for including me and BlackRock in your conference. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to speak with you, even if it is in a little bit of a different forum this year. So growth companies have been getting an inordinate amount of coverage in the financial media. The FANG stocks in particular have accounted for the lion's share of return in the Russell 1000 Growth Index, and these companies seem to be more popular than ever. And part of that is because of the tremendous run and the degree of outperformance these companies provided for investors in the bull market over the past several years. But we saw in Q1 of this year, when we came into the coronavirus pandemic, that growth stocks actually provided significant downside protection relative to the market and relative to value stocks as well. And from where we sit, our observation is that this trend is really just the unmasking of a multi-year trend that's been happening quietly in the US stock market, specifically the migration of quality from other parts of the market into growth equities. Now, you can observe this in a number of different ways, but if we just think about growth business models, they're capital light, they're technology based in many cases, they have strong earnings growth, and many of them offer high degrees of free cash flow relative to their value counterparts. If we learn anything from this pandemic, it's that those companies that are flexible, able to adapt on the move, and sort of be ready for challenges and disruptions in customer activity or supply chains are the ones that are likely to do well in the future. And this pandemic, in many ways, drew a line in the sand between companies who were headed in the right direction and those that were likely to struggle or may have been struggling anyway. And so, as we think about growth business models more broadly, something really important comes to mind for those of us engaged in portfolio construction. And it's that growth companies in both the large and the mid-cap space have a very different flavor to them than they did 10, 15, or 20 years ago. In the tech bubble in 2000 and 2001, growth was synonymous with tech. Growth investing was tech investing, and it was about the creation of technology. Today, what we're seeing is that the market is much broader than that. Growth is more than tech. It is, however, about the implementation and the use of low-cost technology to gain share. But it's not just tech companies. It's companies in every single part of the market. I'm going to discuss our mid-cap portfolio a little later, and some of our top holdings over the years have been companies in incredibly benign industries. Child daycare, pest control, pool supplies, landscaping supplies, even salvage auto. Now, these don't sound like growth companies, but the low cost of technology and a low interest rate environment has enabled high quality companies to compete in a way that they never could have imagined, a few decades ago. And so, as we look at the universe for growth stocks, it is about way more than just FANG stocks. It's about way more than software or SaaS companies. It's about a group of quality companies that are able to gain market share and able to put technology to use to their advantage. And that's a very different story than what we saw 15, 20 years ago in sort of the initial sort of .com era. Now, this was really evident during the initial stages of the pandemic, right? The business models that did best were the ones that were best prepared. Capital light business models, but their products became in higher demand, right? E-commerce, telemedicine, areas of the market such as these saw an amazing acceleration in the demand for their products and services. And as I said earlier, we knew that the market was heading this way anyway. Companies that were already struggling in the marketplace, that were drawing down on big lines of credit just to stay afloat, these companies were not necessarily able to adapt in the same way that a capital light growth business could adapt. And so that is what this pandemic has really done for growth companies. It's shown a light on the firms that are able to be flexible and able to move and adapt and pivot when your customers stop coming through the door. So I wanted to also provide a little bit of color on the large cap space versus the mid cap space. We have a lot of questions about the concentration in large cap growth and the fact that so few companies are driving so much return in the Russell 1000 Growth Index. And this is true, right? We see that a lot of gains are sort of accruing to Amazon and other companies that were already in the right place at the right time. But what this narrative dismisses is many of the companies we see in the mid-cap space, firms that were doing the right things, taking the right steps, and ultimately operating businesses that were also very well prepared. Maybe they don't engage in cloud computing or e-commerce. Maybe they serve customers, or maybe they provide municipal software or other business models that aren't quite as attractive as Amazon's. But these companies are out there. And in the mid-cap space specifically, I think a lot of benefits are going to accrue to firms who were already setting their businesses up for sustained growth in the future. Now, if we think about mid-cap stocks in general, mid-cap companies have quietly provided investors in the US with some of the best risk-adjusted returns historically, especially relative to their small and large cap peers. Now, this makes sense intuitively. If you're a small company and you grow in market cap, you're doing something right. You're getting bigger, your sales are increasing, and hopefully you're able to translate that top line of sales to good, solid operating earnings at the bottom through expense management and prudent investment decisions and things like that. But these companies have graduated the small cap universe. They have shed a layer of risk in doing so, and yet they have more potential and more runway and more headroom to generate returns than many of their large cap peers that they compete against. And so if we think about that for a minute, less risk, higher return or return potential creates the opportunity for higher risk-adjusted returns. And empirically, in the United States, mid-caps have in fact offered better risk-adjusted returns than small caps or large caps. When we look at Sharpe ratios over a multi-year period. And I think that makes a lot of sense, but we see across investment plan menus and home office models, mid-caps are almost systematically underutilized. These companies make up approximately 20% of the total market cap in the United States, and yet it's not uncommon for us to see weightings in them at only 5 or 8% of sort of shelf space within a plan. We believe that because of this digital transformation, because of the effect of this pandemic, and because of the quality that has shifted into these business models over the past several years, that mid-cap stocks are likely to play a more important role in driving returns within portfolios in the future. In fact, because of their risk-adjusted return characteristics, we expect financial professionals to begin to place a little bit more emphasis and lean a little bit more heavily on mid-cap stocks as a driver of return, as a driver of capital appreciation within portfolios. Another reason we believe this to be true is that we think the US economy has changed. We know that we are not an industrial economy, a manufacturing economy like we used to be. And because of that, the consumer and the services industry plays a very important role in driving growth in the US and driving output and GDP in the US. But one very interesting observation, which you could see on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, is that in the last bull market, or during the last bull market, productivity here in the US lagged productivity growth in every other economic recovery, going back decades and decades in American history. And that's curious because we all have iPhones and iPads and laptops, and it feels like we're more productive and efficient. But yet nationally, productivity growth has been low. And we believe the reason for that is those themes, those buzzwords and those trends, innovation and disruption. These are not just buzzwords, they're very real themes that are occurring and unraveling under the surface of the equity market. And what it means is that for every Amazon, there is a long trail of companies who sort of died on the vine trying. And when you have this occur, not only in e-commerce, but across so many industries and corners of the market, what that means is that productivity is sort of dampened nationally, even as companies under the hood are able to generate a lot of return. And when this is the case, we think that what this means is that when we go back to normal and we sort of have a vaccine and we come through this environment, that growth companies will be viewed as more important within portfolios because they can generate their own organic growth. They can stand on their own two legs. They don't need to wait around for a catalyst for growth. They don't need inflation. They don't need interest rates in many cases. They don't need commodity prices or materials prices or even GDP growth above 2% to grow. They could do it on their own. And these are the sorts of companies we're looking for within our portfolios at BlackRock. So let me take a minute and describe the investment process that we deploy on the BlackRock Mid-Cap Growth Equity Fund and some of the people behind the investment process that make it work. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, our team manages about $35 billion in growth assets for the firm. About $10 billion of which is in our mid-cap growth equity strategy, which is run by Phil Ravinsky in New York. Phil Ravinsky and Lawrence Kemp manage our U.S. growth team. And they've worked together for almost 20 years at this point, and they've deployed a very consistent investment philosophy and process for the majority of that time. The philosophy is quite simple, and it's this. The worst thing you can do as a growth manager is do only one thing well, is be one-dimensional, is source alpha and excess returns from one part of the market. The investment process for this fund was actually put in place long before Lawrence and Phil arrived at BlackRock, when they were asked to lead a growth equity effort in the shadow of the tech bubble. And the one thing that was apparent to them back then was that those managers who only included one type of company in their portfolios were the ones that performed most poorly when the market turned negative. And so the philosophy that Phil and Lawrence deploy here is one that seeks to drive alpha from a number of different sources. We want our excess returns not to come from one industry bet or one type of company or one sector. We want them to come from a number of different places. We want it to be derived from valuation expansion, from quality companies, from free cash flow companies. And most importantly, we want our alpha to come from stock selection so that we know the work we have put into researching these companies is what's coming out the other end in terms of performance. And that our performance is not driven by a single factor over time or a very narrow group of companies. Many of the managers that had a one-dimensional strategy had a really tough time in sort of navigating these markets in Q1 of this year. And so in terms of the implementation of this process, what we do is bring three different, distinct, and unique types of business models together within our portfolio. We call them superior growth, durable growth, and periodic growth. Superior growth companies are the companies you think of when you think of growth investing. Amazon is the best example in the tech space, but there are many, many other examples that a company like IAC Interactive in our mid-cap fund. These are companies whose earnings are growing at a higher rate, and you pay a valuation premium for them because you expect that the expectations that the market has of these companies are not high enough. Even though they're relatively more expensive, you buy them because you think they are going to become more expensive. Now, these companies are really important drivers of return. They're critical within portfolios, but it's very important that we diversify risk away from these companies within our portfolio. And so the most important thing about BlackRock Midcap Growth is that 60% of our assets are actually in what we call durable growth companies. And durable growth companies are companies that allow us to participate in a compounding stream of earnings over time. These are not necessarily the most expensive companies in the universe. They trade a little bit less expensively. And the key in understanding their growth is that it's not the magnitude of growth that matters, it's the duration of growth. So whereas superior growth companies are priced for high growth, durable growth companies are priced for longer growth. And we believe our advantage is in understanding that duration of growth. When the market's pricing a company at 8% growth for 2 years, but we think this firm can grow at 8% for 4 years or 5 years. And that is durable growth investing. In fact, we think these sorts of companies are probably the sweet spot of the US growth market today because in many ways they're overlooked by investors who just want to focus on those big growth companies that are in the financial press. Now, the last thing we do is we actually blend out exposure of superior and durable growth with what we call periodic growth investing. And these are companies that do need a catalyst. They do need a little help, whether it's in the form of a commodity price or maybe it's interest rates or inflation. They need the assist to grow. Frankly, we don't have any of these stocks in the fund today. The opportunity set in this environment is really quite limited. And so we sold our last periodic growth stock back in 2019. So the key here is that we bring these 3 different types of companies and business models together. And what that does is it creates a little bit of a more diversified portfolio, but it still enables us to be very, very active in our stock selection. So our portfolio will usually have an active share above 80%. In fact, for most of the years we've managed it, it's been in the 90s, but yet we still are able to have 55 to 85 holdings. So it's still really a diversified portfolio. And the benefit of blending these 3 different types of business models together is that they push and pull in opposite directions. And so we think that provides our investors with a better chance of achieving smoother returns and better downside protection over a full cycle. And in fact, that is the goal of our portfolio. So what kinds of companies are these? Well, I mentioned Amazon. I mentioned IAC Interactive as superior growth companies, but durable growth companies are quite different. And many of these have been so visible within our fund in years past. And what's distinct about these businesses is they actually are able to take advantage of a longer term tailwind. One of our longer time holdings that's no longer in the portfolio as a result of the coronavirus pandemic is a company called Bright Horizons Family Daycare. And this is a firm that was really able to tap in to longer term trends, more two-parent working households, more non-cash benefits offered by companies, the use of technology to help people be able to see their children on their smartphones at daycare facilities. Many of the Bright Horizons facilities were very close to big corporate centers. These are the sorts of stocks that we look for because they can take advantage of those long-term tailwinds, and yet they can still put technology to use to grow market share. Another great example is a company called Copart. And Copart has been a long time holding in our mid-cap growth fund. And this is a firm that engages in salvage auto. It sells used cars online. But Copart has been able to take advantage of the fact that miles driven in the US has trended up and to the right for a long time. Accidents per mile has also gone up and to the right, and the cost of those accidents has also gone up nearly every year for the past several decades as cars become more complex. Teslas have so many sensors in the bumper, and so it doesn't take as much to total cars like that. These are the sorts of companies we look for because they enjoy these long-term tailwinds and they have very few competitors within the marketplace. Now, in terms of competition, if you ask our research team, what is the most important thing you focus on or you think about when you're evaluating a company, they will say the competitive advantage of the company. This is the backbone of our research effort, and it's so important to us to get this right because as growth investors, the biggest risk that you run is when you try to find a company and you've overstated their competitive advantage. You think they're going to be able to grow at a very high rate for a very long time, and yet they're not able to do it. Because a competitor has come in and has changed their course of business for the worst. We try to avoid adding these companies into our portfolio. And so our research effort is really set up to try to identify things that can make a company perform better than peers and can insulate them from competition. This is the first and last question we ask our analysts when they come to us with a proposal. Can tell us about the competitive advantage of the company, walk us through how they can keep competitors at bay. Because if there's one thing we learned in Finance 101 or business school or Econ 101, it's that profitability and high returns attract competitors. We know this was as true 100 years ago as it is today. And so we find it very important to be able to make sure our companies have a very high degree of competitive insulation. From a sector perspective, what we're trying to do with the Mid-Cap Growth Equity Fund is to put together a portfolio that provides a very pure play exposure to the mid-cap growth universe. So even though we have an active high conviction portfolio that's designed to try to deliver excess returns, we don't want to get it from companies that aren't mid-caps. We don't want to experience style drift within the portfolio or market capitalization creep. We want to look like the Russell Mid-Cap Growth Index. We don't want to get returns from big sector exposures or sector bets. And we want our market cap posture to be very close to the index level so that investors can know from a market cap or style or exposure standpoint that our portfolio should be very similar to what's widely represented as the mid-cap growth universe in terms of the Russell Index. The last thing that I'd like to comment on is risk management. Risk management at BlackRock is the absolute backbone of how we engage in research and portfolio construction. And risk management is apparent at every stage of our research process. But we have some really great abilities to do pre-trade modeling and stress testing on our portfolios to ensure that each incremental stock we add to the portfolio is actually providing the benefit that we seek, and it can sort of express our view of higher returns or desired higher returns in the future. So the most important thing about risk management for us is that our risk budget, our tracking error in our portfolio, comes from stock selection. The last thing we want is to deliver a portfolio of 60 stocks where we've done a lot of research on these companies, and yet all you're getting is an exposure to momentum or exposure to the tech sector. That's, in our view, not truth in labeling. And so we, again, want the work that we put in on the research front to drive our returns on the back end. Now, those returns are strong, but what we are most proud of is how we achieve them. And if we think about those excess returns, they have been driven by stock selection in every economic sector, 11 of 11 economic sectors since 2013. So this is our proof in the pudding. It means that stock selection is driving results for us, which is what we want. It means that returns are not one-dimensional, which we want to avoid. And it means that returns come in the form of a lot of little wins across a lot of places in the portfolio, every sector, in fact. This gives us confidence that we can continue to drive not only excess returns, but downside protection for investors, which we know is paramount, especially in the retirement space. And so as I think about the elements of this portfolio that have made it work so well over the years, it's that durable growth companies or earnings compounders make up the bulk of our assets. We find great growth companies outside of the tech sector across all sectors in the market, and the returns are spread thinly through a number of different industries and sectors. If we can continue to do that, we think we can have really a place for retirement investor portfolios in the future, and that's really our goal. So let me close with a quick summary of my comments. First, we really do believe that the market for growth stocks has changed because of innovation and disruption, and we think that in the aggregate, the growth index is much higher quality than it has been in years past. We also think that the mid-cap space is uniquely positioned to accrue a lot of the benefits of this wave of technology and this digital transformation we have seen. And this was really evident to us during the coronavirus pandemic, at least in the earlier stages. So these are long-term structural tailwinds that should help companies in our part of the market. And if we can execute on stock selection, we can provide a risk-centric, balanced, pure play mid-cap growth portfolio. We think we can drive returns and higher risk-adjusted metrics in the future for investors. So a very important part of the market, a really unique part of the market from a stock selection standpoint, and a place of within the U.S. market that we think is likely to be or to have a little bit more shelf space in the future, especially if we go back to a low growth, low inflation, low return environment. I wanted to thank you again for providing me the opportunity to speak with you today. and I'd love to answer any questions that you have on BlackRock or the mid-cap growth strategy. Thank you so much.
Hello and welcome to Presentation Best Practices. I'm Gretchen Barris. In my role with Principal, I spend about 15% of my time presenting to clients and prospective clients between 200 million and several billion in plan assets. But I spend 85% of my time preparing to do that. Over more than 2 decades, I've borrowed from the successes of others and honed what I've seen work. These best practices have helped me maximize my results, and I'm looking forward to sharing them with you. I recognize that you have a variety of roles and presentation scenarios, so the aim is that there's something helpful in here for each of you. Let's get started. As human beings, we tend to think we're unique and special, and we are, but just perhaps not as much as we think we are. Up and down the market, we all have the same challenge. From the client's seat, it's a sea of sameness out there, both visually and with regard to the messaging we all use. As an example, these are the look and feels from some of your competitors. A lot of repeat themes and even color schemes. No wonder they think we're all alike. So the question becomes, how do you differentiate yourself and your team? Add to that, the average close ratio is just under 10%. Doesn't seem so bad until we recognize that that means that 90+% of what we work on goes nowhere. Too much wasted effort, too many demands on our time, both personally and professionally. We can do better. So how do we change the paradigm? The answer is that it's all in your preparation. So when does your pitch begin? The sale starts way before you ever walk in the room. It starts with your very first interaction with your prospect. Gone are the days of the parking lot prep. Take any sport, hobby, or avocation. The pregame is everything. It's no different here. In my own practice, I've found the pregame ritual the single most effective predictor of success. The reason is because it's the best way to differentiate yourself from your competition. Remember our sea of sameness? There are some things we can control and things we can't. Product offerings, the look of approved materials, even sometimes the degree of natural ability of presenters on your team. All things we can't control. What we can control is how well prepared we are. I'm going to crack open an average opportunity and lead you through how I get prepared. Your first warm-up drill should be to schedule a prep call with the prospect. Why? Well, a prep call helps you learn more about the client, their organization, their culture, roles, agendas and hidden agendas, preferences, history, and background that can be very valuable in how you build your team and your story. It also shows you care about more than just winning the business and allows you to begin building rapport and trust with your contacts. This is also where you gather critical background information needed to help you determine how you can help solve the client's current challenges and how your partnership might look in the future. I find this is a key differentiator every single day. I think it'll be valuable for you too. The other key objective is to eliminate surprises wherever possible, allowing you to better plan for outcomes. So you're probably wondering how these calls go. It's critically important to settle on an effective way to catalog and organize this information, something that allows you to quickly and efficiently navigate the discussion on the phone or in person. To help you save time, fill in the information you already know about the prospect, things you've gotten from LinkedIn, Hoover's, Google, company website, all a wealth of information that allow us to do some key homework in advance. If needed, then you can confirm specifics during the conversation, or you can quickly move to the next section of the document so you can spend more time discussing topics you don't have as much information on. This is something I've created and honed over the years to suit just this purpose. Here's a sample company background information template that's partially filled in. Again, you want to do this before the call so you can easily jump to sections highlighted in yellow and confirm the outstanding information with the prospect. Areas shaded in blue indicate information you still need to confirm internally. A very well prepared presentation can easily be submarined by tech snafus. We probably all have war stories to share on that front. I'm a belt and suspenders girl. I take no chances on what should work. Ask questions about connectivity, like HDMI connection if an iPad and VGA extension if a laptop, Wi Fi connections, whether it's a private connection that needs advanced setup, web based, application based system. And then I bring a backup and a backup for my backup's backup. This avoids real time fire drills and keeps the presenting team's tension level low. If you find yourself sometimes presenting with subject matter experts who are experts in their field but not professional presenters, logistic follow ups can make things unnecessarily challenging for these teammates. It's my job to remove that guesswork. I ask questions like time, location, and length, advance access to test equipment and technology connectivity. What do the seating arrangements look like? I want to be able to prep with my team if we need to prep standing. That's a different ballgame for everybody, but especially those less experienced presenters. What is the format, delivery method? I want to know if someone's going to need to stand at a podium because that's the connection length that we'll have to advanced technology. And then the room setup itself. Are we sitting at a boardroom table or is this meeting going to be set up in a classroom style? And do we have the ability to move things around? I've gotten all different answers to those questions, but one thing remains. I want to remove as many possible question marks before I walk in the room. Post call, I make myself take a step back and ask, what's important to the client? This ensures I will address what they want to hear rather than just what I want to tell them. This also forces me to reassess the team needed as presenters, subject matter experts, etc., based on the information provided by the client. Next, let's talk about the tips to help you craft the message. It's natural to think about why we win, but it's equally important to ask yourself, why do we lose? In fact, one of the questions of my overview for the client, advisor, or consultant that I'm visiting with to prep is, what are our obstacles? I frequently get great information here. Sometimes I ask the question, is there anything that would prevent us from doing business together? Either way, I'm aiming to get information about things that they're not expecting me to ask, anything that is on their mind that might be a surprise in the meeting that we should be prepared to address either before the meeting or at the meeting. If you answer these questions candidly for yourself, the presentation comes together very easily. Focus on what's important to them. If you can't answer why it matters to this client, then it doesn't belong in this presentation. The first 7 seconds is where each presenter establishes credibility. Coach your newer, weaker presenters to open up with a simple intro of themselves, their role, how they work with their clients, and why they love what they do. It's easy to talk about yourself as an icebreaker, and it makes things friendly and warm at the outset and warms up people who have more difficult time establishing credibility or comfort level in public speaking. Also use drawing parallels to your culture with theirs. Things like care and concern for the environment, the community, their employees. The more specific, the better. When I send my presenting team an overview of the message and time allotments, I tell them to be prepared to deliver their topic in half of the time. If it's going well, you'll spend half of the time in discussion. If you're crunched for time, each speaker will need to be able to hit the salient points quickly and effectively, and that way they'll be prepared to do so. And when I sit down to prep with my teams, I have them do it both ways. People remember 4 to 7% of what they've heard just an hour later, but they remember 100% of how they feel. Your job is to create a feeling directed at solving their problems, leveraging their time, and improving their outcomes. Treat it like you would a job interview. You are the most important visual aid. Visual aids are an accessory, not the story. Different types of learners, visual, auditory, and tactile, will be in your audience, so incorporate all 3 types for best results. I remind presenters not to fall into the trap of, on slide 24, you can see, Moving to slide 25, we show, and on slide 26, we have provided, it's dull and linear. Instead, tell the story and let the slide be eye candy. It's the old adage, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is a good example of how we used a graphic to help a client see how, as their plan assets grew and participant count remained stable, their pricing decreased over the history of our relationship. I'm showing it to you in electronic format, but we actually had it bound in a hard copy as well. And we asked them to draw the dots at the tops of the lines and then connect them across the horizontal axis so they were actively involved in seeing how this works and where we'd been historically. Overly simplistic, but the truth is we're working with shorter and shorter attention spans. Consider one of the best examples of this illustrated by Microsoft. As digital consumption is increasing, our attention spans are declining. The researchers studied brainwaves of human beings with high digital consumption and compared them to goldfish. In 2000, the study found that the attention span for humans started to decline at 12 seconds. Attention spans of goldfish experienced a decline at 9 seconds. Fast forward several years, a decade plus, and more digital consumption. The goldfish was still at 9 seconds, but human attention span had declined to 8 seconds, 1 full second shorter than that of a goldfish. This is important information to keep in mind as we're building presentations. When crafting your message, one of the most powerful things you can do is show that you've done your homework. Not all in the meeting will have been on your prep calls. So by outlining your understanding of their objectives, what the current strategy looks like, and your proposed strategy and how it differs, and what the new structure would bring them and their participants, it gives you a nice opportunity to showcase results of like clients and give them a feel of what it would look like to work with you and your team. Consider opening your meeting with an "Our understanding of your objectives" slide, which outlines what you learned in your prep calls and allows you to quickly level set for anybody in the committee who wasn't on your prep call. Once I have my materials built, I put together what I call a flow overview for the team. This outlines the specific coverage assignments for topics, key points I want each presenter to hit, and timing allocations for the presenters, as well as materials that they'll have to use, videos, demos, etc. I leave nothing to chance. That way, each presenter can see what every other presenter is covering and the allotments of time for each speaker so that we don't exceed our total allowable time. And next, it's time to master the delivery. Beyond prep, the single most important thing you can do to enhance your position and that of your team is practice. So here are some key tenets of how practice makes permanent. First off, location, location, location. Practice in a place as similar as possible to the one where you'll be presenting. Visit the real place in advance if you can, and go through your final rehearsal there. Be sure to rehearse with audiovisual equipment you'll be using, and never let technology that you're unfamiliar with be part of the equation if you can prevent it. Slim it down. As you keep rehearsing, you may learn that you're presenting too much information. Eliminate anything that's redundant, especially across the team as you rehearse as a group. In both words you say and slides you show. Make your sentences simpler. The perfect verb or noun doesn't need a modifier. You'll get your points across and get points from closing down before your time is up if you've saved a few minutes for question and answer. Practice with variety. Every time you say your presentation, say it a little bit differently. The goal is to keep it conversational and not memorize exact phrases. It should sound natural, like you're having a cup of coffee with a friend. Timing. Know how long you're allotted and manage to that time. That's the case for each and every presenter in your group. And then practice. Have two versions ready, the full version and the half version. Transitions. Know who you're handing it off to. Each presenter should be very familiar with who precedes them and who follows them, and who determines if the order changes. And then finally, get help. When you're ready, rehearse with a live audience. People who can listen with the eyes and ears of your intended audience and give you a frank appraisal of how you're doing. Ask them if you're using non-words, fillers, etc., or using dated terms or concepts, or saying anything that's unclear or potentially offensive, exhibiting any tics or causing any distractions you're not aware of. Rehearse the Q&A part of the presentation too. Ask your team to throw you some curveballs and keep track of difficult questions that you've gotten so that you can launch them at your team and they can practice their answers as well. Pause and breathe. Allow yourself and your audience a little time to reflect and think. Don't race through your presentation and leave your audience as well as yourself feeling out of breath. You have control of the meeting and you determine the pace. As long as your audience is staying with you, a pause, especially a pregnant pause, can be very effective. Be sure you're maintaining sincere eye contact with your audience. Use the 3-second method, looking straight into the eyes of a person in the audience for 3 seconds at a time. Make sure you have direct eye contact with a number of people in the audience, sweeping the corners and not just focusing on the person with the most seniority or the most authority in decision making. That will be obvious to your audience. You want to make sure you make the entire audience feel involved. Filler words are probably one of the things I get the most questions about. How do I eradicate filler words? The absolute best way to eradicate filler words is by prep and rehearsal. Very simply, the equation goes, the better you know what you're going to say, the less likely you are to use filler words. When I was a new rep early in my career, a team of us were trained to make presentations regularly. And there was a coach that they hired for us who would come in and drop pennies in a jar each time we used a filler word. What we realized, though, was that the magic happened after he left, when we would drop pennies in a jar for each other. And as time went on and we knew the presentations better, there were just simply fewer pennies in the jar. And the same goes for our prep and rehearsal each time that we make our presentations. With regard to gestures, generally the larger the gesture, the more powerful. However, we're living in a day of virtual presentations and large gestures look strange. In a virtual presentation, make sure your gestures are a little bit closer in to your body. They can still be wide, but don't make them very close to the camera and the screen. They'll make your fingers and hands look disproportionately large. Also, don't point at your audience and don't script your gestures. Make sure they're natural and that they flow with your words. Tone and volume can be a great way to bring back attendees in a presentation that have drifted away. We've all seen this. It's the person that walks in a room with 3 or maybe 4 devices and they're always on one of them at any given point in time. When you get to the point in the meeting where you know something's critical for that person to pay attention, change your tone or your volume to get them back into the meeting. Works like a charm. And don't read from any notes for an extended length of time. Notes are fine to glance to, but I do limit notes to bullet points. People that write out scripts are just simply too tempted to follow the script. And there's no script that's better than a message coming from the heart. Leaving nothing to chance, next you turn your attention to ensuring that the group's interaction is also natural and anticipated. How should questions be handled? The goal for presenters should be to get a question from all stakeholders. Ask client open-ended questions 2 to 3 times throughout the discussion, not just at the end. When you get a question, listen carefully and listen for attitude. The first thing you should do when you receive a question, especially if you need a little bit of time to think about your answer, is paraphrase it back to make sure you understand it completely and understand the nature of why it's being asked. That'll give you time to provide the best response. If a question occurs to be out of topic order, address it briefly and promise to come back to address it later in the discussion if it really needs more explanation. Otherwise, address it fully and move on. If there are no questions, have a team member be prepared to ask a question of you or another speaker that you'd like to be asked. This should be talked about in the prep process ahead of time. What do you do about sidebar conversations? Generally, let them go. If and when it's a distraction to others, try to use a pregnant pause to stop it. If that doesn't work, ask if they have questions or want to review a particular topic on the assumption that maybe they're still talking about something that you were talking about prior. Just be careful not to embarrass. How do you handle the constant questioner? First, you need to determine how constant the questions are viewed by the other stakeholders. If it's obvious the other stakeholders would like it to stop, then there are a couple of ways to handle. First, just try to avoid eye contact with that individual. Secondly, if that doesn't work, offer to meet with them afterward to discuss any additional questions they might have. What do you do if you're going long on a subject because of a stakeholder interaction? Try to get the additional time you need in the meeting if you feel something's important that is going to be cut. Make a statement such as, I see you're really engaged in this subject, and we have a few more things we'd like to cover. Would it be okay if we extended by 5 minutes so we were sure that we can address all that's on your mind? If the answer is no, ask if they'd like to continue on with the subject at hand or move on. How can you help a teammate who's nervous during a presentation? It's fine for them to let the client know they're a subject matter expert and not a professional presenter if that will take the tension out of the room and let them relax. I've seen that happen effectively several times for particularly nervous presenters. And finally, agree ahead of time with your team on a designated person to field questions that the team needs help with. Usually it's the quarterback of the team, ostensibly you, who will do that, but just make sure that everybody's aware of who that is. Sometimes people find it harder not to be the one presenting. When you're not on deck, be sure you're supporting your teammates by using your body language to actively listen attentively and offer encouragement. Make sure you don't look distracted. Smile at the speaker and remind them to smile as you told them you would in prep. What do you do if a teammate says something in the meeting that you know is incorrect? Before you respond, ask yourself, is it absolutely critical to correct what was said, or could it be overlooked, or could it be corrected later, post-meeting, in a follow-up discussion? The bottom line is that if something is absolutely critical and essential to the client's understanding or something that's being asked for reinforcement, then you need to jump in and address it. Sometimes a clean way to do that is to reinforce that there's new information available since that speaker might have been aware, and then help correct the misunderstanding that way. After the meeting, get the team together or schedule a call to Red Team right away. The basis of this is a forum to share candid thoughts and feedback about what went well and what did not. All comments are welcome. Brainstorm on ways to improve topics and delivery of the answers or tough questions. Make sure you add any such questions to your running list so you have them for prep with future teams for future meetings. We've covered a lot of information today. I hope you were able to take a few helpful ideas to enhance your process and your results. What questions do you have for me?
Good morning to our West Coast friends, and good afternoon to our East Coast friends. On behalf of Wilmington Trust, we want to thank you for joining us today. We hope you're safe and healthy. Although we'd rather be all together in Southern California right now, today we're going to discuss CITs, growth of CITs, and some common misconceptions. I'm Val Ferrara, and I cover sales for our sub-advised collective trust funds, covering half the country with my counterpart, Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe Donovan, and I'm privileged to cover half the country with Val.
Feel free to email Joe or myself as any questions come up, and we'd be more than happy to help you and your efforts in the retirement plan space. So let's take a look at CITs 101 and the growth of CITs. CITs are no longer the industry's best kept secret. The concept of CITs is certainly not new anymore. Although they've gathered a lot of momentum lately, for years they've been gathering market share in defined contribution plans. There are a few eye-opening stats we want to share with you today. Total CIT assets are now over $3 trillion. That's a 64% increase from 2011, when they were $1.8 trillion. This is strong growth, and we will touch on which asset classes have benefited from this growth. The second eye-opening stat is that CITs now make up almost a third of all 401k plan assets and have now jumped to $5.2 trillion. Mutual funds now make up less than 50% of 401k plan assets and should be a key consideration for your practice when you're speaking with your clients. We'll continue to walk through the benefits of CITs and key considerations for CITs. What is a CIT? A CIT is a pooled investment vehicle for qualified retirement plans. Oversight of CITs is performed by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or otherwise known as the OCC, and/or state banking regulators. They're available for defined contribution and defined benefit plans. Excludes 403(b) plans and excludes retail retirement plans such as IRAs. I'd love to touch on the timeline as it relates to the history of CITs. CITs were first created in 1927. They actually predate mutual funds. In the 30s, the IRS allowed defined benefit plans to use CITs. And in turn, we were predominantly seeing DB plans use CITs in the 40s and 50s. We can now fast forward to 1974 when ERISA was enacted and we had our very first 401k plan. CITs were allowed in 401k plans, although at that time, primarily in the form of stable value. Fast forward to 2000, CITs started trading on the NSCC just like mutual funds do. Then we had 2006 when the Pension Protection Act was passed and QDIA was implemented, primarily in the form of target date funds. There were CITs, however, with high minimums. 2012, we had 408(b)(2) and fee compression, which sparked greater fiduciary focus on fees. And you had asset managers say to themselves, should we come out with a CIT for other strategies? And they have. We also want to help answer plan sponsors' questions and advisors' comments as it relates to wanting their participants to be able to Google something. In 2019, we did a partnership with the NASDAQ, and now there are tickers for CITs. Joe and I would love to hear from you if you'd like to see a CIT 101 piece or go into any more education as it relates to CITs. The CIT 101 piece has this timeline at the bottom, and then also has this chart on the next page here doing the side-by-side of mutual funds and CITs. So investing in a mutual fund versus CIT. I would almost argue CITs are more regulated than mutual funds as they were held to ERISA standards, where mutual funds are overseen by a board of directors. They do require a participation agreement, which some advisors may think is an obstacle. However, we've created a user-friendly experience. It's important to note what information is generally included in a participation agreement. There are many different ways and names to say it: investment management agreement, custody agreement, adoption agreement, but in the end, it's a participation agreement and it's really the information in it. One of the key things you'll find in those agreements is that there is representation that the plan is eligible to invest in a CIT. The first piece is verifiable. What is the plan type? The second piece is what is the representation? Does the plan sponsor confirm that the plan does not have any prohibitions in their governing documents? Even though it's a 401k plan, their investment policy statement or the plan documents may limit the plan to only invest in mutual funds. So now you're getting the plan sponsor to agree to the terms of the fees and any conditions applicable to the CIT or investment strategy. In some cases, the declaration of trust would be an exhibit built into the participation agreement, which is a description of the strategy or any potential limitations that it may impose. And for mutual funds, we're all familiar with a prospectus, which has similar disclosures. We've seen participation agreements range from clicking a button with a few paragraphs to dozens of pages. Depends if the declaration of trust is attached. Essentially, you will have the reps and warrants and description of any fees. We're finding advisors are getting more comfortable with the participation agreement, and it's easier for them to deliver this to the plan sponsors. And as an advisor, you've done a great job educating the plan sponsors, whereas a mutual fund is really just available to anyone. Over the next few months and years, our goal is to get the process even more streamlined, so it's easier for advisors, clients to adopt CITs. We're even working on an app so we can continue to evolve the user-friendly CIT onboarding experience. A lot of people say CITs are cheaper than mutual funds. I like to phrase it as fee flexibility. In a CIT, you're able to change the investment management fee depending on the relationship of the plan, size of the advisor's book of business, or relationship overall, and in this case with RPAG. In a mutual fund, there are additional fees which include costs associated with registering with the SEC. I'm going to hand it off to Joe to touch on some myths. I'm sorry, not just some myths, to touch on advisors' business.
That's fine. Thanks, Val. Yeah. So how CITs can enhance an advisor's business. So as we look into some of the key benefits or factors why advisors are recommending CITs to their clients, 6 factors most prominent. First, lowering fees to the participant. In today's environment, with all the uncertainty participants are facing, lower fees help participants maximize each dollar they save, each dollar they invest. Performance in asset allocation, as we know, they're very important, but are not guaranteed. Lower expenses is something that the participant can count on. 2, streamlining the process or practice efficiencies. Advisors are always looking for ways to be more efficient within their practice. CITs have the ability to build various share classes based on the size of the individual plans or the advisor's client's investment into a CIT. So advisors can find their plans fund lineup to find the expense savings with efficiencies to the advisor's practice. 3rd, provide active management options or new CIT strategies. RPAG, excellent example. We've gone from a few active managers, last manager that was added to the platform. But as noted earlier in Val's presentation, growth of CITs as a percentage is surprising given the lack of actively managed investments in the market. So over the past 4 or 5 years, actively managed CIT inventory has increased, as well as the demand for custom solutions like custom target date funds. And kudos to Matt and Kellen with their success with FlexPath. The 4th factor, creating white label products or custom solutions. Over the past 5 years, a number of target date funds, asset class, risk-based model, or actively managed custom solutions have come to market. This allows advisors to bring their best ideas to their clients in an efficient and cost-effective manner. But there are many things to think about, many things to consider, such as, does the advisor's practice have the client base to support the creation of such a custom solution? So you ask, why is that important? That's important because you require sufficient assets that are required to support the maintaining of the solution or the custom investment. Also, keep in mind, record keepers have expenses associated with adding funds to their platform and maintaining them as well. So not everyone has, custom capabilities. So the question is, do the asset managers or partners you're thinking of working with have the track record performing these services? And how will this partner support the advisor in the custom solution? So what we've seen is there are more failures in this arena than successes. The 5th factor, relationships with fund managers or relationship pricing. So exercising relationship pricing to secure best pricing for all your clients. Advisors have realized their books can receive this relationship pricing, and they use their book as leverage to help their clients enjoy lower fees. Another great example where the size and scope of RPAG and the memberships across have earned the right to offer active and target date funds at a lower cost to or unrivaled price anyone in the industry. The 6 is reducing fiduciary risk. So I think we've all seen, the headlines or news regarding fiduciaries failing their obligation to when it comes to lower cost investment options. But I think the short answer here, when you're doing your due diligence on your investment selections, can't stress, but to document. That is a key point that I'd like to stress. And then I think we're moving on to another slide here. How advisors can help assist plan sponsors in selecting CITs. So how can advisors benchmark CIT providers? So here are a few thoughts. All right, the depth of the trustee organization sponsoring the CIT. Is the CIT sponsored by an asset manager special purpose trust company or third-party trust company? What is the internal expertise of the group sponsoring the CIT? Secondly, the CIT trustee's corporate structure. Is the bank or trust company a wholly owned subsidiary of a larger conglomerate? Is it part of their core business? As you know, trusts, CITs are part of our core business, no question. Governance structure of CITs. How do CIT sponsors monitor its sub-advisors, including compliance with investment guidelines, and focus on the firm's commitment to the CIT space? Does the trust company focus their efforts on onboarding and reviewing plans for eligibility? To answer the question, yes, we do. We actually have a dedicated group that screens every participation agreement that comes through to make sure, as Val alluded to earlier, to rep and warrant that they are eligible to invest in a tax-qualified product. Then we move on to, fee considerations for advisors, plan sponsors. So how should advisors and plan sponsors think about fees when considering CITs? So we have a few suggestions. Are the fees fully disclosed in the participation agreement? Or are the fees unbundled or separated in a line-by-line item? And some of the should be disclosed are sub-advisor fees, trustee fees, custody, transfer agency fees and accounting fees, possibly auditing fees and service provider fees. Another question is, are fees accrued like a mutual fund, or will the plan be billed directly? How are fees different from asset classes that are specific to retirement plans, like stable value, for instance? So is the wrap fee disclosed? Are there any other fees associated with these types of funds? Lastly, what would be the exit provision? So hopefully that was helpful. We wanted to move into the next couple of slides of myths versus reality, and Val's got a couple that she wants to talk about, and I'll follow up right after Val with a couple of myths as well.
Thanks, Joe. We're curious what barriers are preventing you, if you've not used CITs already, from using CITs. So feel free to email Joe or myself, and we really encourage those conversations with us because we understand misconceptions do still exist. So CITs lack transparency and periodic reporting. Participants want a ticker, so CITs aren't suitable for DC plans. So we've oftentimes heard this myth. So we hear these concerns, and we in the industry continue to try and tackle these issues. When you say something that is not transparent and you're dealing with investing money, that brings up a lot of concern to end investors and regulators. Some of the things we've done over the last 5 years, and some of the things that we'll continue to do, is provide CIT data. One of the biggest pieces is CIT providers putting their data in Morningstar. So you could send your information up to Morningstar and it gets into their private database, which then gets a Morningstar security ID. That allows for record keepers to pull information into their system so participants can get daily updates on performance of the funds. The second thing is last year, as we keep saying it, but we did the partnership with the NASDAQ, so now there's tickers. We do believe this to be a progressive item, where in the beginning, you really just see performance history and price, which is a huge step forward for participants, plan sponsors, and advisors, that it's more readily accessible. We believe that over the upcoming months and years, we'll be able to add holdings as well as other items such as expenses to the download so that CITs will be up to par in terms of information that is readily available through the internet and various sources. The last area we have to tackle is databases. There are a number of databases that advisors utilize to create reporting for working with their 401k clients and defined benefit plans. Of course, all of you utilize the RPAG system, and we do feed CIT data to the RPAG system. We do believe we work to make CITs more transparent and will continue to evolve in the near future. Our next myth is performance for a strategy will be the same regardless of the investment vehicle. So in fixed income securities that may have been purchased, say, 10 years ago in a mutual fund that may not be available today to a CIT manager would prompt a CIT manager to choose different options. Performance might also be based on tax considerations or different based on tax considerations that portfolio managers make based on the fact that CIT is a tax qualified vehicle and they don't push through taxable gains to the participants in the CITs. Joe will touch on another myth.
Thanks, Val. So the myth is CITs are only for big plans. No, historically, CITs were the preferred investment vehicle for large defined contribution plans with minimum investment requirements. But today, asset managers have realized and recognized the distribution opportunity and eliminated minimums. So plans of all sizes now have access to CITs. So they're not for big plans. They can serve the needs of advisors that have smaller books than others. And again, plan size does not matter. And that comes down to market when we've got our partners that we've worked with to come down to eliminate or lower their minimums. The other myth is it hard to get CITs on record-keeping platforms? So it's actually a fairly simple process. Wilmington Trust has 30 plus trading agreements with various record keepers and custodial platforms. So if this myth comes from an advisor saying that if you're referencing of a new CIT, so to speak, what it takes to have that CIT onboarded to another record keeper is a request. On most cases, the advisor just makes a phone call to their relationship manager at the record keeper. At that point, it's really up to the record keeper. It could take a number of days or weeks to have the QSIP live on the platform. But that is a myth. We've made it a lot more simpler as time has moved on. And great. I think Val is going to say a couple words about the future of CITs.
The future of CITs. So as we continue to address the transparency concerns through many means, including the addition of tickers to share classes, we expect the advancement with tickers will be progressive, with more information continually to be added to the lookups, including holdings and expenses. The industry is working diligently to break down barriers to allow for 403(b) plans to be eligible to invest in CITs. This is something that will help level the playing field for teachers and non-for-profit workers when saving for retirement. We also expect the advent of custom solutions like multi-manager target date funds, risk-based funds, or sector funds to continue to grow as advisors and plan sponsors look for better outcomes for participants. With that, we hope that we've provided a foundational base of CITs. The data that we discussed earlier shows that CITs are gaining traction in the DC marketplace, and there's still several misconceptions that are out there that still exist. So Joe and I are happy to answer any questions as it comes to CITs and helping your practice.
So just to give you a better idea who the team is, Val and I report directly to Rob Barnett, AKA the godfather of CITs. And we're supported by Justin Newberry, and I think Val's got our sales map up there. So if you recognize, you hopefully recognize what state you live in, but feel free to reach out to me and Val. Our contact information is there. We'd be happy to follow up with any questions you have during this presentation.
Great. And then I just want to touch on some of the pieces that we have available. So there is the cheat sheet, a product list for RPAG advisors. There is our availability grid. It showcases all the custodians and record keeping platforms. And then the asset managers we have on our trading agreements. We have the white paper that we discussed before that goes over the myths. And then also the CIT 101 piece that goes over that grid that we spoke about before. Thank you so much, and looking forward to connecting with you in the future.
Well, thanks again. Appreciate your partnership, RPAG, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks a lot.